Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. It was Christmas Eve, and I was at home, wrapping up the last of the gifts. The tree was decorated with twinkling lights, the fireplace crackled softly, and the house smelled of pine and fresh-baked cookies. It was supposed to be a night of warmth and cheer, but something felt off. My family had always been superstitious around the holidays. There were old stories about strange occurrences at Christmas, odd things that seemed to happen when no one was paying attention, whispers in the dark, and things just out of place. I never really believed them, not until that night. I had just finished tying the ribbon on the final gift when I noticed the clock. It was well past midnight. I sighed, thinking how I still had one last present to put under the tree, but I was too tired to bother. I turned off the lights, leaving only the tree glowing faintly, and headed upstairs. Just as I reached the top of the staircase, I heard a faint creaking from the living room. It wasn't unusual for old houses like mine to creak and groan, but this felt different. It was as if something heavy had stepped into the room. I paused, my heart thudding. I strained to hear, but the sound was gone, swallowed by the silence. I shook my head and climbed into bed, trying to push away the creeping unease. As I lay there, I kept thinking about that sound, the way it had echoed in the stillness of the night. The house felt empty, but somehow not. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it again, a faint jingling, like the sound of bells. But it wasn't coming from outside. It was closer, right beneath my window. I bolted upright, my heart racing. I carefully crept to the window and peeked through the curtain. Below, in the snow-covered yard, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, wrapped in tattered robes with long bony fingers gripping something that shimmered under the dim light of the street lamp. A jingle echoed again. The figure raised its head slowly, revealing a face that was barely human. Hollow eyes stared up at me, cold and lifeless as if they could see right through me. And then it started to move toward the house. I slammed the window shut and backed away, my breath shallow and panicked. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs felt frozen. What was happening? It couldn't be real. The jingling grew louder, now coming from inside the house. I could hear it clearly, as if something was walking down the hallway, dragging chains behind them. I covered my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. Suddenly, I heard faint, scratchy whispers. They came from the living room just beyond the door. The whispering wasn't human. It was something cold, something ancient, something that didn't belong. "Leave," they seemed to say. "We're here for you now." Tears stung my eyes as I reached for my phone. I called out to my family, my voice barely audible over the growing noise. No one answered. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen and trembling, before the sound finally stopped. The house was silent again. But when I peeked through the hallway, the living room was empty. The tree still glowed faintly, casting long shadows. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The house felt colder, quieter than it ever had before, and as dawn broke, I knew something had been there with me, something that didn't belong. It was Christmas morning, but the warmth had vanished. It was the week before Christmas when we decided to rent a cabin in the woods for the holidays. My family always wanted to spend Christmas away from the usual chaos of our hometown. The cabin we found was isolated, nestled deep in the forest, surrounded by snow-covered trees. It seemed perfect for a quiet, peaceful holiday, just us and the stillness of the woods. The first night there, everything felt magical. The soft glow of the fireplace crackled, the scent of pine and fresh-baked cookies filled the air, and the lights from our small Christmas tree sparkled in the flickering firelight. For the first time in years, it felt like Christmas was truly about to begin. But as the night deepened, things started to feel off. It began with the silence. The forest outside seemed unnaturally quiet, devoid of the usual rustling of animals in the snow. No howling of wolves, no chirping of birds, just pure, eerie stillness. I remember glancing out the window and seeing only the dark silhouettes of trees, the snow reflecting the dim glow of our cabin's lights. At around midnight, I woke up to a soft, distant chiming. At first, I thought it was from a clock or a bell tower in the distance, but the only thing surrounding us was a snow-covered wilderness. The sound wasn't constant, just a soft, faint chiming that came and went in intervals. I got out of bed, drawn by the sound, and peeked through the frosted window. The forest outside was as quiet as before, but the chiming continued, now louder, more distinct. It was as if something was calling from beyond the trees, a distant, haunting melody. I wasn't alone. My sister was standing beside me, staring out into the darkness. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. We both listened, and the chiming grew closer, echoing between the trees. It wasn't coming from any bell, though. The sound seemed to float through the air, ghostly and mournful. Then we heard it. Footsteps in the snow. At first, they were faint, barely perceptible, but they quickly grew louder. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it. They were not our footsteps. These were slow, deliberate, almost mechanical, like the sound of boots trudging through deep snow. But there was no one in sight. We hurried back to the main room, our hearts racing. The fire had burned down to a low, flickering glow. My parents and brother were still fast asleep, completely unaware of the creeping dread settling over us. My sister and I didn't speak as we stared at the dark windows, waiting. The chiming grew louder, and then, right outside the cabin, we heard it. A soft, muffled cry. A child's voice, barely above a whisper, calling out for someone. We couldn't make out the words, only the haunting tone, echoing in the stillness. My sister grabbed my hand, her grip icy. "We have to get out of here." But before we could move, the doorbell rang. It was a faint chime, so soft we might have missed it if we hadn't been listening. I froze, staring at the front door as the sound echoed through the cabin. I was too afraid to move, too frozen to respond. We stood there, waiting. The chime came again, louder this time, more insistent. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I approached the door, my breath shallow. When I opened it, there was no one there, no footprints in the snow, no car, just silence, except for the chiming, which now came from inside the cabin. The room felt colder, the fire almost out. The glow from the tree seemed dimmer, almost fading. I could hear it now, the sound of small footsteps inside the house, moving, circling the tree, as if something was searching for something we couldn't see. My sister grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the corner of the room. We clung to each other, terrified. I glanced back at the door, half expecting to see something standing there, but the night was still. The footsteps continued, growing louder, heavier. I could feel them drawing closer. Then, through the dim light of the tree, I saw it. A figure. A child, its outline barely visible against the dark, moving towards us with slow, unnatural grace. Its face was hollow, its eyes empty voids. It didn't speak, but the chiming followed it wherever it went. Tears streamed down my face as I realized what it was. A child, lost in the woods, forever searching. And now, it had found us. The chiming grew louder, consuming everything. And as I held my sister tighter, I knew we were not alone anymore. It was the night before Christmas, and the snow blanketed the world in a serene, pristine layer of white. My family had gathered at our old country home, a place that had seen many Christmases over the years. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The house smelled of pine and cinnamon, and the atmosphere was warm, comforting. But something wasn't right. It all started when my younger sister, Sarah, noticed something strange hanging on the tree. At first, it seemed like another ornament, an old, faded figure made of fabric, resembling a doll. But it wasn't a regular ornament. Its eyes were hollow, stitched shut, and its grin was wide and unsettling. No one had seen it before. No one had placed it there. "I don't remember this," Sarah said, pointing at the strange figure. We all gathered around the tree, staring at the doll in silence. Its presence felt out of place, like it didn't belong. My parents tried to reassure us, explaining that it must have been one of those forgotten ornaments from years past, but something about the way the doll seemed to watch us, almost as if it was waiting, made my skin crawl. That night, as we tried to go to sleep, I kept hearing faint whispers, almost like they were coming from the hallway outside my room. I sat up, straining to listen, but there was nothing but silence. It was a soft, persistent murmuring, like someone, or something, was calling from the other side of the door. At one point, I thought I saw something move outside my window. A shadow, shifting through the falling snow, too tall and unnatural to be human. I pulled the covers tighter around me, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, we all gathered in the living room, the Christmas tree still glowing with its colorful lights. But when I looked closer, my heart skipped a beat. The doll was no longer hanging on the tree. Instead, it was sitting in the middle of the floor, its stitched eyes staring up at us. No one had moved it. The room felt colder, the fire suddenly less comforting. My parents were starting to look uneasy too. "It must have fallen," my mom said, though she didn't sound convinced. We exchanged glances, and then Sarah pointed toward the window. "The snow," she whispered, her voice trembling. The window was frosted over, but faint, claw-like scratches ran down the glass, as if something had tried to get in. Throughout the day, strange things kept happening. The doll would appear in different rooms, always sitting in the shadows, always watching. Whispers followed us as we moved through the house, soft, disembodied voices that spoke in a language we didn't recognize. That night, as we sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows across the walls, the whispers grew louder. The house seemed to shift, as if it were alive, watching us from the corners. Suddenly, the Christmas lights flickered, then went out altogether. The only light came from the dying fire, casting long, flickering shadows. The whispers grew louder, and then they stopped. The house was deathly silent. For a moment, all we could hear was our own breathing. Then a sharp, echoing knock at the door. None of us moved. My heart was pounding. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was outside knew we were there. My father hesitated before getting up, his hand shaking as he reached for the door. His voice trembled as he asked, "Who's there?" Silence, but the knocking didn't stop. Finally, he yanked the door open, and outside, there was nothing but snow. The yard stretched out before us, silent and untouched, the fresh snow glistening in the moonlight. We never found the doll again. The snow was falling softly as I made my way home that Christmas Eve. The town was quiet, the streets coated in a thick layer of frost, and the air was filled with the crisp scent of pine and cold. It was supposed to be a peaceful night, full of warmth, laughter, and the joy of the holiday season. But something felt off. I live alone in a small old cottage on the edge of town. It's the kind of place that's cozy in the daylight, but come nightfall, shadows stretch and twist, hiding things just out of sight. This cottage had been in my family for generations, handed down from my grandparents. Every Christmas, I'd tried to hold on to those traditions, decorating the tree, hanging stockings, setting out cookies for Santa. It was what kept the holiday alive, even as the years passed. But tonight, there was an uneasy stillness that seemed to hang in the air, a quiet that felt almost too quiet. As I stepped inside, the warmth of the fire greeted me, crackling in the fireplace. I hung my coat, poured myself a cup of cocoa, and stared at the tree in the corner. The lights twinkled softly, casting flickering shadows across the room, creating patterns on the worn wood of the floor. It should have been comforting, but instead, I felt a chill creeping up my spine. I was about to settle down when I heard it, a faint noise from upstairs. It wasn't loud, just the faintest creak, as if someone had walked across the old wooden floor. My heart jumped. I lived alone, or at least I thought I did. Slowly, I set my mug down and grabbed a flashlight from the table. The house groaned softly as I made my way to the staircase, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The sound of my own breathing seemed too loud, too hollow in the silence. I reached the top of the stairs, and the hallway stretched before me, dimly lit by the soft glow of the Christmas lights. The noise had stopped, but I could feel something watching from the darkness. I moved cautiously down the hallway, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I approached the door to the guest room, the source of the sound, I stopped. The door was slightly ajar, as though someone had pushed it open and forgotten to close it again. A chill ran through me as I pushed the door open fully. The room was untouched, exactly as I'd left it, except for the subtle scent of something unfamiliar, something faintly metallic and sweet, like old pine needles. Then I saw it, a figure standing by the window staring out into the snow-covered landscape. Its back was to me, and though it was motionless, I could sense something deeply wrong. It wasn't human. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. My legs refused to move. The figure slowly turned, and in the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the window, I saw its face. It wasn't a face at all, really. Just a void where the eyes and mouth should have been. Empty sockets where something dark and unknowable lurked. The creature tilted its head, as if curious before taking a step toward me. I finally found my voice and backed away, bumping into the wall. My hands shook as I lifted the flashlight, the beam illuminating its form. It was tall, too tall, and thin, with long limbs that seemed unnaturally elongated. But it wasn't the creature's height or its features that terrified me. It was the feeling of cold, ancient emptiness radiating from it. As the creature moved closer, I realized it wasn't walking. It was gliding, its feet never quite touching the ground. It was like some twisted version of the Christmas spirit, something that didn't belong in this world, something that should have been lost to the shadows of another time. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, though my voice cracked with fear. The creature tilted its head again as if it didn't understand the question. And then, in a slow, deliberate voice that wasn't a voice, it whispered back, "I am the gift you did not ask for." I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused. It took another step forward, and this time I felt its presence brush against me. The cold it carried was unbearable, seeping into my very bones. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature vanished. The room was empty again, the door now fully closed, as if nothing had happened. I stayed frozen in place for what felt like hours until I finally mustered the courage to leave. I locked the door to the guest room, unsure of what I had just witnessed. The rest of the night passed in silence, but the fear never left me. Every Christmas since that night, I've kept the guest room door shut, unwilling to ever open it again. I don't know what that thing was or why it chose to visit me. But every Christmas Eve, I can't shake the feeling that it might return, waiting in the darkness, watching. It started snowing the night before Christmas Eve. The thick flakes fell gently, blanketing the town in a quiet, serene hush. Everyone was tucked away in their homes, the scent of pine and cinnamon filling the air. The decorations were strung up, lights twinkling against the darkened streets, as if to ward off the creeping shadows of winter. For as long as I could remember, my family had gathered every Christmas Eve in our old, creaky house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't a grand place, but there was a warmth to it, especially on nights like these. My parents would make hot cocoa while we hung stockings by the fireplace, listening to the distant chime of a church bell, reminding us that Christmas was near. But something felt different this year. The house felt quieter. The usual hum of holiday cheer seemed muted, almost subdued. My parents were quieter than usual too, whispering softly as they busied themselves with the last-minute preparations. My younger sister, Emma, was the only one who seemed unfazed. She was as excited as ever, twirling around the living room with her favorite doll in hand, oblivious to the strange stillness. That night, after we finished decorating the tree, I decided to step outside for a moment of fresh air. The world had turned into a quiet, snow-covered expanse, the soft glow of the streetlights casting long shadows on the pristine white ground. It was peaceful, serene, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. As I stood there, listening to the soft crunch of snow beneath my feet, I heard something else. A faint, distorted voice, almost like a whisper, carried on the wind. I turned, scanning the snowy landscape, but there was no one there. Just the wind, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the creeping dread. The next morning, Christmas Eve, felt even more surreal. The snow was deeper now, untouched by any footprints, as if the entire town had been locked in some quiet, frozen slumber. My parents still didn't seem themselves. They moved through the house with the same muted silence, exchanging brief, worried glances that sent shivers down my spine. That evening, when we all sat down for dinner, Emma brought out the old box of Christmas stories as she always did. We'd read from it every year, tales of Santa and his elves, of magical forests and snowy adventures. But as Emma read, something caught my attention. An odd story, one I'd never seen before. It wasn't from the usual box. The words seemed to blur as I read them, but one phrase stood out. The visitors who come in the night, silent and cold, will leave only shadows. I read it aloud, my voice trembling. My parents exchanged another glance, their faces pale, and Emma stopped mid-sentence, staring at me with wide eyes. The whispers from the night before returned, louder now, circling around the house. The lights on the tree flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. I wanted to ask my parents what was happening, but the words stuck in my throat. There was a feeling in the air, heavy and oppressive, like something had been waiting. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept hearing those whispers again, so faint but unmistakable. They seemed to come from down the hall, from the old attic. I couldn't ignore them. I knew something wasn't right. I crept out of bed and made my way to the attic door, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. As I reached for the knob, it turned under my trembling hand. Slowly, I pushed the door open. The attic was dark and cold, filled with the scent of dust and old wood. In the corner, there was a figure, hunched and silent. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze fixed on me. There was no face, only shadows where the eyes should have been. "What are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond, but the whispers grew louder, surrounding me from all sides. I backed away, my legs shaking, and the door creaked shut behind me. When I turned, the house was eerily quiet again, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I woke to the soft sound of snow falling outside. The house was still. Too still. My parents were gone, vanished without a trace. Only Emma remained sitting by the window clutching her doll. She turned to me, her face pale, and spoke in a soft, distant voice. "They didn't come for us. Not yet." I followed her gaze to the window where a figure stood at the edge of the property, blending into the swirling snow. The shadows of the night had returned, and they were waiting. The snow had been falling all day, blanketing the small village in a thick, white layer. It was the week leading up to Christmas, and the town was wrapped in a quiet, festive atmosphere. The streets were lined with twinkling lights. Shop windows displayed elaborate holiday displays, and the air carried the faint scent of pine and cinnamon. But something about that Christmas Eve felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Though everything seemed perfectly normal on the surface, the village was silent, and the only sounds were the crunch of our footsteps through the snow as we walked home from the local pub. We lived on the outskirts of town, in a small old cottage that had been in the family for generations. My parents were busy preparing for the holiday, but I decided to take a walk through the woods that bordered our property. The quiet of the night, paired with the soft glow of the Christmas lights still lingering in the trees, felt magical, even if something felt wrong. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the wind began to pick up, rustling the branches overhead. There was a strange stillness to it. No wildlife, no distant sounds of life that should have been there. The air felt heavier, almost oppressive. I shivered and pulled my coat tighter around me. That's when I heard it, a faint rhythmic sound, like the tapping of fingers against glass. It was coming from somewhere deep in the woods, further than I had intended to wander. My heart quickened, but curiosity pulled me forward. The sound grew louder, more distinct. The tapping echoed through the trees, mingling with the soft crunch of snow beneath my boots. I pressed on, the distant glow of our cottage fading behind me. The forest thickened, and the sounds became louder, more insistent. Then I saw them. In the dim light of the forest, I spotted what looked like shadows moving between the trees. They were not ordinary shadows. They were darker than the night itself, shifting and writhing as if they didn't belong to this world. They moved slowly, silently, and there was an unnatural stillness about them. My breath caught as I watched, unable to tear my eyes away. The shadows were drawn to a figure that seemed to materialize from the mist. It wasn't human, not exactly. Its form was vague, almost translucent, yet it seemed to radiate an otherworldly presence. A chill ran down my spine as I realized it wasn't alone. There were others, ghostly figures, their hollow eyes staring into mine. They seemed to drift between the trees, their expressions blank, their mouths twisted into silent cries. I could hear faint whispers now, carried on the wind, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. Suddenly, a flash of movement drew my attention. In the distance, I saw a figure moving toward me, moving unnaturally fast, far too fast for a person. It wasn't a person. It was wearing a tattered, faded Christmas sweater, one I didn't recognize, and it was pulling something behind it, dragging a heavy sack through the snow. I couldn't see its face, just the shape shifting between the trees. My instincts screamed for me to run, but my feet refused to move. The figure grew closer, its pace relentless. The sack behind it thumped against the ground with each step. When it was only a few feet away, the figure stopped, and I could feel its gaze on me, cold, empty, and infinite. The whispers from the shadows grew louder, surrounding me from all sides. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was no answer. The figure only stared, the eyes beneath the sweater hollow, dark, and lifeless. Then, from within the sack, I heard a faint, muffled sound. A child's laughter. But it wasn't joyful. There was something twisted, almost mechanical about it. The laughter echoed through the woods, sending a shiver down my spine. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure in the faded sweater, as it began to move again, slowly, dragging the sack behind it, as if it were searching for something lost, or something it could take. Tears blurred my vision as I turned and ran back toward the safety of my home, the figure and its haunting sack never far behind in my mind. When I reached the edge of the woods, I looked back, expecting to see nothing but trees and snow. But in the distance, I saw the figure once more, standing at the edge of the forest, its gaze fixed on me. The sack still over its shoulder, heavy and dripping with shadows. Christmas wasn't the same that year, and it hasn't been the same since. The snow fell softly, blanketing the small village in a pristine white. The streets were eerily silent, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, especially for this time of year. Every house was adorned with twinkling lights and wreaths, and the festive atmosphere was supposed to feel warm. comforting. But something about this Christmas felt off. I had just moved into a quaint old cabin on the edge of town, nestled between the forest and the last remaining houses. The cabin was charming, with its wooden beams and roaring fireplace, but it had a history, one I hadn't been fully aware of when I'd signed the lease. That first night, as I unpacked my belongings, I heard faint footsteps outside, crunching through the snow. I peeked out the window, but saw nothing, only the glistening trees in the distance. The sound of laughter echoed through my thoughts, distant and hollow. I convinced myself it was probably just the wind or some lingering echoes from the neighboring homes. The next morning, I awoke to a strange noise, soft, rhythmic tapping on the cabin's front door. I got up and opened it, expecting to find nothing but snow and stillness. Instead, I was met with a wreath, slightly askew, lying on the porch, as if someone had placed it there and simply walked away. As the days passed, the odd occurrences became harder to ignore. I'd find small, childish drawings of snowmen and reindeer on the windows, their faces twisted into disturbing grins. The air felt colder, almost as though something unseen was watching me from the shadows. One night, just days before Christmas, the wind howled outside, carrying with it a low, almost sorrowful wail. I couldn't sleep, the sound too unsettling. I lit a candle and sat by the window, watching the snow fall in heavy flakes. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock on the front door. My heart leapt. The cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor. No one should have been out in this weather. I approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. There was no one there, only the same wreath lying in the snow. I backed away, locking the door behind me. That's when I noticed the faint sound again. The same rhythmic tapping from earlier, this time louder, insistent. It came from inside the cabin. I followed the noise, moving toward the attic. My heart pounded harder with every step. The door creaked open slowly and I climbed the ladder, the light from my candle flickering wildly. When I reached the top, the tapping stopped. The attic door was ajar, pushed open just enough to let a faint light escape. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it all the way open. Inside, the space was filled with old, faded Christmas decorations. Most of them were decades old, stored away and forgotten. Worn, tattered garlands, broken ornaments, and dusty stockings. But something didn't feel right. It wasn't just the dust and decay, there was a lingering sense of wrongness. That's when I noticed them. Hundreds of small, childlike figures made from twisted branches and snow. They sat in a circle surrounding something beneath them. Their hollow eyes seemed to stare at me, and their frozen smiles sent a chill down my spine. In the center of the circle, there was a small, rotting tree. Too old, its branches bare and brittle. Underneath it was an old, crumpled photo. The faces in the photo were blurred, but I could make out the outline of children, their features twisted in silent screams. As I stared at the photo, a whisper filled the attic. It wasn't words, but a cold, hollow breath. A voice I could feel more than hear. "They're still waiting," it seemed to say. Terrified, I dropped the photo, rushing down the ladder. I didn't stop until I was back in the warmth of the cabin. The door shut tight behind me. On Christmas morning, I found the wreath had been hung properly, as if someone had entered while I slept. But the drawings were gone. The sounds had stopped. Whatever had been there wasn't gone. I could still feel it watching me somewhere, in the shadows of that quiet, snow-covered village. I've always loved Christmas. The lights, the music, the cold nights that seemed to invite warmth and comfort. But that year, something about the season felt off. My family had always made Christmas a big deal, decorating the house, gathering by the fireplace, watching cheesy holiday movies. It was our favorite time of year. But that year, things were different. The house felt quieter. The tree didn't feel as bright, and no matter how many times I hung the ornaments, they never seemed to shine as they used to. It started on Christmas Eve. I just finished decorating the tree, now lit by flickering candles instead of the usual electric lights. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. My parents had gone to bed early, leaving me alone, and I was content to spend the night reading by the fire. That's when I heard it, a soft, muffled tapping. At first, I assumed it was just the wind, but it didn't come from outside. It was coming from the attic. A slow, rhythmic tapping, like someone was knocking on the wooden ceiling. I froze, heart racing. The attic had always been off limits. We kept the door locked, mostly because of the old family heirlooms and the vague warnings my parents had given us. Things better left undisturbed. But that tapping, it was persistent, never stopping. I stood up and moved toward the attic door, my hand trembling as I reached for the rusty handle. The knocking grew louder, more urgent, like someone or something was trying to get through. I turned the knob and slowly pushed open the door. Dust and cobwebs fell onto the floor as I peered inside. The staircase to the attic stretched into darkness, shadows swallowing it whole. The tapping continued, softer now, almost melodic. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I climbed the creaking stairs, the cold air brushing against my skin. Each step felt heavier, like the very house didn't want me to reach the top. When I reached the attic, I pushed the door open. The space was vast and empty, filled with the scent of old wood and dust. The tapping had stopped. My breath echoed in the stillness. I scanned the room, eyes adjusting to the dim light that barely seeped through the small window. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the attic, a figure stood perfectly still. A figure in a tattered, once white robe, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The figure didn't seem to breathe, yet I could feel its presence, cold and unrelenting. It took a slow, deliberate step forward, and I backed away, heart pounding in my chest. As I stumbled, I knocked over an old wooden trunk. The lid creaked open, revealing what was inside. Christmas ornaments, all of them tarnished and cracked, faded with age. And that's when I realized what they were. The faces of the ornaments were distorted, hollow, as though someone had carved them with care but forgotten what joy was. The hollow, lifeless eyes seemed to watch me. Silent, lifeless. The figure took another step, and I could feel my legs giving out beneath me. The attic began to shift, the floorboards groaning beneath its weight. Shadows flickered along the walls, growing darker, more menacing. I stumbled back down the stairs, slamming the attic door behind me, locking it as quickly as I could. The tapping started again, louder now, as though whatever was up there was trying to get out. That Christmas was never the same. The house never felt the same. Every holiday after, the tapping returned. Soft at first, always coming from the attic. And each time, I swear I can hear faint whispers, something inhuman, something not quite human, calling my name in the darkness. Even now, I leave the attic door closed, locked and untouched. I can still hear it, faint and distant, but always there, waiting. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year. The snow-covered streets, the warm glow of the holiday lights, the joy of family gathering. It was supposed to be a time of warmth and celebration, but that year, something felt off. It started the night before Christmas Eve. I was at home, the tree sparkling with ornaments and tinsel, the fireplace crackling as soft holiday music played in the background. I'd just finished wrapping the last gift when I heard it, the faint sound of someone knocking at the front door. I frowned, glancing at the clock. It was late, too late for any visitors, especially in this quiet neighborhood where few people came and went. Still, curiosity got the better of me, and I made my way to the door. There was no one there. Shrugging it off, I locked the door and returned to my warm, quiet living room. But the knocking came again, this time from a different part of the house. I froze, my heart racing as I moved cautiously through the darkened hallways. Each knock seemed closer than the last. By the time I made it to the front door again, I was certain someone was playing a cruel joke, but when I opened it, there was still nothing but snow and silence. That's when I noticed something strange. Footprints leading away from the door, small, childlike, but distorted. They didn't look quite human, more like they had been dragged through the snow, clumsily formed. I followed them outside, but they disappeared almost immediately, swallowed by the whiteness. I returned inside, locking every door and window. My phone buzzed, and when I checked it, I saw a text from an unknown number. "You can't hide from me." My hands shook as I dropped the phone onto the counter. Whoever it was, they were watching. The night passed in uneasy silence. I kept the lights on, every door and window bolted, but the feeling of being watched never left. It wasn't until morning that I felt any relief, the sun rising slowly over the horizon. On Christmas Day, I woke to the sound of something scraping against the windows. I rushed to look outside, expecting to find nothing, but what I saw made my blood run cold. There, pressed against the glass, was a face. It wasn't human. It couldn't have been. Its eyes were dark, hollow, and sunken, and its grin was too wide, too crooked, like a twisted mask. It seemed to watch me, unmoving, as if waiting. I slammed the curtain shut, heart pounding. Whatever it was, it hadn't moved. I didn't hear it leave. I didn't hear it leave. The rest of the day was a blur of fear and exhaustion. I stayed indoors, refusing to go near the windows, unwilling to face whatever, or whoever, was still out there. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the strange footprints, the ominous text, and the face at the window. Christmas was supposed to be about joy and warmth, but that year it had become something far darker. The knocking started again, this time from inside the house, and I realized with a chilling certainty that whatever had been watching me hadn't gone anywhere. I never really believed in ghost stories, especially around Christmas. The season was supposed to be about warmth, family, and joy, not fear and dread. But that all changed one year when I stayed at my grandmother's old house for the holidays. The house had always been full of memories, filled with laughter and the scent of homemade cookies baking in the oven. It was the place where my family gathered every Christmas Eve. But something about the house felt different that year. It wasn't just the usual quiet that followed after everyone had gone to bed. It was unnatural. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, hearing the usual sounds of the house settling, the creaks of old floorboards and the soft whistling of the wind outside. But then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it, a faint jingling. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like the faint chime of bells, but not like the ones from A Christmas Carol. It was slow and eerie, like something out of place. I got out of bed and walked toward the door, peeking out into the hallway. The old house was silent again. I figured it must have been my imagination, so I decided to head back to bed. But as I closed my door, I caught a glimpse of something in the hall mirror. Movement. I froze. The reflection in the mirror didn't look quite right. It wasn't my own reflection staring back at me. Instead, I saw something pale, with hollow eyes, like they were watching me from beyond the glass. The image faded before I could fully make it out, leaving only darkness behind. Shaking, I made my way back to bed, trying to convince myself it was just the shadows playing tricks on me. But as I lay there, the jingling sound returned, closer this time, louder. I could hear faint footsteps now, slow and deliberate, like someone dragging themselves along the floorboards. I peeked out once again, but this time I saw it, the silhouette of someone in the hallway. They were swaying, slowly moving toward my door. Panic set in. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure came closer, and I could hear its soft, raspy breathing. It wasn't human, though. There was something eerie about the way it moved, like it was gliding just above the floor. The faint jingle of bells grew louder. Then, without warning, the door creaked open. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure dressed in tattered old clothes with a pale, gaunt face. It had hollow eyes, black and empty, and a grin stretched across its face. Wrong, unnatural. Its fingers were long, thin, and bony, twitching in the dim light. I tried to speak, but my voice trembled and broke. The figure stepped closer, its head tilting at an impossible angle. "Do you believe now?" It whispered, its voice like the sound of frost cracking on ice. Its breath smelled of something ancient and decayed. "The bells have been ringing." Before I could react, the figure was gone, vanishing into the shadows of the hallway. The jingle of bells faded with it. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching my blanket, unable to shake the feeling that something, whatever it was still there, lurking in the darkness. I didn't sleep until the first light of dawn spilled through the windows. Christmas morning came, and though my family gathered in the same house, laughing and exchanging gifts, I couldn't escape the memory of that night. I never mentioned it to anyone. I'm not sure if they would have believed me, but deep down, I know what I saw, and I'll never forget the sound of those bells. It was the week before Christmas, and the air had a strange, unnatural chill to it. The town was typically alive with festive cheer, twinkling lights, carolers singing, the scent of gingerbread cookies wafting from every corner. But this year, something felt off. I had just moved into a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't far from the town center, but far enough to feel isolated. My neighbors seemed to keep to themselves, which suited me just fine. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year, but something about this season felt different. Distant. One evening, after a long day of unpacking, I noticed the flicker of Christmas lights coming from a house down the street. It was dimmer than most, not the usual bright, sparkling display that lit up the neighborhood. The windows were mostly dark, save for a small warm glow in one corner of the house. Curious, I decided to take a walk. There was something almost magnetic about that faint light, a pull that felt stronger than it should. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the frost-bitten ground. As I approached the house, the feeling of unease grew stronger. I peered closer through the window, and I swear, I saw a figure sitting in a chair by the dim glow. It wasn't moving, just sitting still in the flickering light. The room seemed oddly familiar, as though I had seen it before. Familiar yet distant, like a memory half forgotten. Without thinking, I knocked on the door. It creaked open slowly, as if pulled by a phantom hand. I stepped inside hesitantly, the cold air biting through my coat. The inside of the house was eerily untouched, as if it had been frozen in time. Dust covered the furniture, and the once cheerful Christmas decorations were faded and faded further by the years. The small tree by the window was withered, its ornaments hanging like decayed memories. I called out, my voice trembling, but there was no response. The silence was deafening. I made my way further into the house, stepping carefully over the creaking floorboards. The dim light cast long, distorted shadows on the walls, distorting the room like something out of a nightmare. Then I heard it, the faint sound of whispering. It was a soft hum, barely audible, almost like a song, but not a happy one. It was haunting, mournful, as if the house itself was singing a lullaby to the emptiness inside. In the corner of the living room, I saw a figure again, motionless, staring at the withered Christmas tree. Its eyes glinted in the dim light, hollow and empty. I took a cautious step closer, the whispering growing louder in my ears. Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling as I extended a shaky hand. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It only stared, its face hidden beneath a pale hood. The closer I got, the colder the air became, until I could feel the frostbite creeping into my fingertips. The whispering turned into a low, mournful chant, growing louder and more desperate. "Stay with us," it whispered, and I felt a sudden wave of dread crash over me. I staggered back, my breath visible in the frigid air. The figure raised its head, revealing a face twisted in sorrow. Empty sockets stared back at me, and its mouth opened as though it was about to speak, but no sound came out. A chill ran down my spine, and I knew, whatever it was, it had been waiting for me. In that moment, I realized this house wasn't just abandoned. It was haunted by something far worse than I could imagine. I didn't stop to wonder why. I turned and ran, sprinting through the icy streets, the whispers of the house following me, louder and more urgent. I never looked back. The snow fell gently, blanketing the small town in a serene, untouched white. It was Christmas Eve, and the air was filled with the faint smell of pine and the distant chime of bells echoing through the streets. Everyone was wrapped up in the holiday spirit: decorated houses, warm fires, the laughter of children. I lived in a quiet, old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. My family and I had always cherished the simple traditions of Christmas, but this year felt different. There was a strange sense of silence, even as the festivities raged on around us. The usual cheer of neighbors was replaced by an unsettling stillness. That evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape, we heard the faint sound of a bell ringing. It wasn't from any of the nearby homes. The sound seemed to come from beyond the trees, beyond the fields, somewhere far away where nothing could be seen. My parents exchanged uneasy glances but brushed it off. "It's probably someone from town," my father said, though his voice trembled slightly. As night fell, the house grew colder. The fire we had lit barely seemed to push back the chill that crept through the walls. My younger sister, Emma, insisted on leaving out cookies and milk for Santa, and we humored her. It had always been a tradition. But as I was about to sleep, I heard it again, closer this time. The faint chime of the bell, like an echo of distant footsteps, now seemed to drift from right outside our door. I got up, tiptoeing to the window, heart pounding. The darkness was thick, the trees beyond the yard barely visible under the weight of snow. There was no one there, no footprints in the snow, no sound except that persistent, distant ringing. I went back to bed, but sleep eluded me. The house felt too still, too quiet. And then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard something else, a faint, whispering voice. It wasn't loud, but it was close, closer than I expected. "Merry Christmas," it murmured, soft and cold. A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't move. My eyes stayed fixed on the ceiling, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers grew louder, louder still. "Let me in," they whispered. "I have something for you." I threw the covers over my head, shaking. Whatever it was, I didn't want to know. But the next morning, everything seemed normal again. The snow still blanketed the world outside, the trees sparkled with ornaments, and the warmth of the morning sun had returned. My family was cheerful, opening presents and celebrating the day. That night, as we sat by the fire, my sister spoke up. "Did you hear the bell last night?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. I froze. "Yes," I whispered. "Did you?" She nodded. "It was strange. It wasn't from Santa. It was from someone else. I didn't sleep that night either." Every Christmas Eve, my family has a tradition. We gather at my grandparents' old farmhouse, deep in the snowy countryside. This year was no different, except for one thing: the storm. By the time we arrived, snow was coming down in thick sheets, the wind howling like something alive. The farmhouse looked like something out of a postcard, with its warm lights glowing through frosted windows, the scent of pine and gingerbread filling the air. The night started out perfect. We laughed, exchanged stories, and sipped hot cocoa while the snow piled up outside. My cousins and I decided to explore the attic, a place that had always fascinated us. It was packed with old trunks, faded decorations, and other forgotten treasures. But that night, it felt different. The air up there was colder, heavier, and the smell of must and something sharper lingered. We found a box labeled Christmas Memories in my grandmother's handwriting. Inside were photos, old ornaments, and a small porcelain figure, a Santa Claus with black eyes. It was no bigger than my hand, and its features were just slightly off, like the smile was too wide and its head tilted just a bit too far to the side. We showed it to my grandmother, expecting her to tell us its story. But when she saw it, her face went pale. She snatched it from my hands and muttered something about it being a family heirloom that should have been left alone. She placed it on the mantel above the fireplace and told us not to touch it again. That was when things started to go wrong. As the night wore on, the storm worsened. The power flickered, then went out entirely, leaving us in the dim glow of candles and the crackling fire. We huddled together in the living room, wrapped in blankets, when we noticed something odd. The Santa figure was gone. At first, we thought my grandmother had moved it, but she insisted she hadn't. My cousins and I searched the room, checking under the furniture and even behind the mantel. Then we heard it. The faint sound of bells, jingling softly, coming from the hallway. We froze. The sound grew louder, closer, and then stopped abruptly. My uncle, thinking it was a prank, walked toward the hallway with his flashlight. We followed hesitantly, the house eerily quiet except for the crunch of snow being blown against the windows. In the hallway, the light of his flashlight caught something. Footprints in the snow. They were small, like a child's, leading from the back door toward the stairs. The door was still locked, bolted from the inside, and no one had come in or out. The prints didn't make sense, and yet there they were, melting slowly in the warmth of the house. The jingling started again, this time from upstairs. It was faint, almost playful, but there was an edge to it that made my stomach churn. We all went silent, exchanging nervous glances. My grandmother whispered, "Don't go up there." But of course, curiosity got the better of us. We climbed the creaking stairs, following the sound of the bells. The air grew colder with every step, and by the time we reached the second floor, our breaths were visible in the flashlight beam. The jingling led us to the attic door, which was ajar. A faint glow spilled out, as if someone had lit a single candle inside. We pushed the door open slowly. The attic was just as we'd left it, but in the center of the room was the Santa figure, sitting upright on an old rocking chair. Its black eyes seemed to glisten in the dim light. Surrounding it were small, wet footprints, circling the chair in chaotic patterns. Then the rocking chair moved. It was subtle at first, just a slight creak as if caught by the wind. But there was no wind in the attic. The chair rocked faster, and the jingling grew louder, more frantic. We stood frozen, too terrified to move, as the figure's grin seemed to stretch wider. The flashlight flickered, plunging the room into darkness. When it came back on, the chair was empty. The figure was gone. We bolted downstairs, hearts pounding, slamming the attic door behind us. The jingling followed us, echoing through the house. My grandmother, pale and trembling, began muttering prayers under her breath. She told us that the Santa figure had been a gift, a curse, passed down through the family. It only came out during Christmas storms and always brought something with it. We spent the rest of the night huddled in the living room, too afraid to move. The storm finally broke around dawn, and with the first light the house felt warmer, safer. We searched every inch of the farmhouse, but the Santa figure was nowhere to be found. I never went back to that farmhouse. My grandmother moved out the following spring, and the house has sat empty ever since. But sometimes, on Christmas Eve, I hear the faint sound of bells outside my window carried on the wind, and I wonder if it's found a new family to haunt. The snow was falling gently that Christmas Eve, blanketing the world in white. It was a rare, peaceful snowfall, covering the small town in a soft, frozen shroud. Everyone was tucked in, waiting for Santa, the warmth of the holiday spirit filling their homes. But not all stories of Christmas are so comforting. I had always loved the quiet, peaceful nights leading up to Christmas. The smell of pine from the tree, the soft glow of the lights, and the faint sound of carolers drifting through the cold air. But this Christmas, something felt different. It started the night before. I'd been helping my family set up the tree, just like we always did. But as we hung the last ornament, there was a sudden, unsettling creak from the attic. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The attic door was slightly ajar. "It's probably just the wind," my dad said, but even he sounded uncertain. Still, we finished decorating and pushed it from our minds. After all, it was Christmas Eve, a night for joy, not fear. But that creaking stayed with me, like a whisper in the back of my head. Later, I found myself unable to sleep. The house was too quiet, too still. Every creak of the floorboards felt louder, each gust of wind through the drafty windows felt colder. I kept hearing faint, hollow footsteps from above, like someone was walking through the attic. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the noise was persistent. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next morning, Christmas Day, the house felt different. I went downstairs to find that the tree lights were flickering strangely, casting unsettling shadows across the living room. The cheerful red and green garlands looked almost menacing under the dim glow. Under the tree, there were strange tracks in the snow. They weren't the usual tracks from birds or small animals. They were large, distorted, and seemed to appear from nowhere, leading toward the attic door. I slowly approached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The attic door was wide open now, creaking as if something had been moving around up there all night. "Dad?" I called out, but there was no answer. I reached for the attic light and flicked the switch. The bulb flickered once, then died. Darkness poured down the stairs. The footsteps above resumed, more deliberate now, more insistent. It wasn't the wind or some creature outside. Whatever was up there, it was real. Panic started to set in. I didn't know what to do. Should I call for help? But who would believe me on Christmas Day? Everyone was supposed to be safe, happy, and warm. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They sounded like they were coming down the stairs. I backed away, my breath visible in the cold air. The tree lights went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. But then I heard something else. Whispers. Low, guttural whispers that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me. I couldn't tell if they were voices or something else, something deeper, something ancient. Suddenly, a faint glow appeared from the top of the stairs. It wasn't the warm glow of Christmas lights. It was cold, spectral, like a dim, flickering candle. A figure emerged, obscured by the darkness, its form shifting and distorting. Its eyes were hollow and empty, but they seemed to be watching me, staring right through me. It moved silently, yet with purpose, descending the stairs with a slow, eerie grace. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch as it reached the bottom, its whispering filling the space between us. It wasn't Santa Claus, that much was clear. The figure stopped just inches from me. It didn't speak, didn't even seem to breathe. It merely stood there, staring, its presence heavier than the darkest night. Then, in an instant, the whispers stopped. The lights flickered back on, casting a cold, hollow glow over the room. And just like that, the figure was gone, vanished into thin air. I didn't sleep again that night. The house remained silent, as if the world itself had gone still, holding its breath. On Christmas morning, my family gathered around the tree, oblivious to the terror that had visited the night before. I didn't tell them what I had seen. How could I? Who would believe me? Even now, I don't know what it was, a spirit or something else entirely. But I know one thing for certain. Something walked through the darkness that Christmas Eve, something that was not supposed to be there. And sometimes on quiet nights I can still hear the faint whispers. It was the week leading up to Christmas, and the town had already descended into a festive haze. Lights strung from house to house, families bustling around with shopping bags, and the sound of carolers echoed through the cold, crisp air. But beneath the jolly surface of the season, something felt off this year. I had always loved Christmas. The warm glow of the fireplace, the sound of wrapping paper being torn apart, and the scent of pine filling the house. But this year was different. It started with the letters. Each morning, I would wake up to find a folded envelope tucked under the front door. No return address, just a crisp, formal handwriting that seemed almost old-fashioned. At first, I assumed it was a harmless holiday card, but when I opened the first one, my blood ran cold. The letter was short, but the message was chilling. You'll never escape the cold of Christmas. I couldn't make sense of it. It wasn't signed, just those words. I dismissed it at first, blaming the late-night stress and the strange winter fatigue I'd been feeling. But every day, the letters kept coming, each one eerier than the last. One afternoon, as I stared out the window, watching the snow fall gently, I noticed something strange. The street was quiet, unusually so. No carolers, no laughter, just a thick, unnatural silence. My phone buzzed, pulling me from the window. Another letter. I opened it, trembling this time. It was a simple drawing. A snow-covered path, lined with tall, shadowy figures that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. Beneath it were more of those words. Follow the path. There's no escaping. My heart pounded as I looked outside again. The shadows seemed deeper now, the snow swirling unnaturally. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, the wind howled, rattling the windows like fingers scraping glass. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those figures from the drawing, standing in the distance, watching. At midnight, a knock at the door jolted me awake. My stomach twisted as I approached the entrance. The air outside was freezing, as if the temperature had dropped far beyond what it should be. The knock came again, sharp, deliberate. Hesitant, I cracked open the door, expecting nothing. But there, standing in the snow, was a figure cloaked in a tattered, old-fashioned coat. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me with hollow eyes. Before I could react, they turned and began walking toward the snowy path from the drawing. My feet moved on their own, following them. It was as if something was pulling me forward, guiding me into the night. The path stretched on forever. The snow didn't stop falling, but now it felt heavier, colder. The world felt empty, as if Christmas had been drained of life. The silence was deafening, but I kept walking, unable to stop myself. Suddenly, I heard a voice, low, almost inaudible but unmistakably there. The cold is always watching. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I turned around, but there was nothing. Just the endless empty trees, their branches heavy with snow. When I looked ahead again, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the path. A figure much closer now. They were tall, faceless, but their presence was overwhelming. The wind whispered through the trees, as if pleading with me to turn back. But I couldn't. The figure began to move, gliding toward me with an unnatural grace. Then, as if breaking the silence, they spoke once more. You'll never escape what you've become. I tried to run, my legs shaking beneath me, but they were faster than anything human. The snow seemed to pull me down, dragging me deeper into the cold. My breath came in short gasps, my vision blurring with exhaustion, and then, in the distance, I saw it. The faint glow of a light. It pulsed softly, almost inviting. Desperate, I moved toward it, the figure still behind me, its footsteps echoing through the snow. When I finally reached the light, I realized it wasn't a salvation. It was a trap. The light wasn't warm or comforting. It was cold, flickering like a dying flame. The figure emerged from the shadows once again, its face now visible, just a void where the eyes should be. Welcome to your eternal winter, lost one. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the sound of whispers carried on the wind. Merry Christmas. Christmas Eve had always been a time of warmth and joy for me. Family gathered around the tree, laughter, the scent of pine filling the air. But that year, something felt different. It wasn't just the usual quiet of the holiday season. It was as if the world had grown eerily still. We lived in a small town, surrounded by dense forests that stretched far beyond what anyone cared to explore. The snow-covered trees stood silent, and the only sounds were the crunch of our boots in the snow and the faint crackling of the fire in the living room. The town had a charm to it, sure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. It started late in the evening, after the gifts had been opened and we were all settled around the fireplace. My parents were dozing off, and I sat in the dim light, staring at the flickering flames. That's when I first noticed it, the soft sound of footsteps in the snow outside. At first, I dismissed it. Maybe it was a neighbor taking a walk, someone out for a late-night stroll. But the footsteps were rhythmic, deliberate, almost like they were following a pattern. I leaned closer to the window, peering through the frost, but all I could see was the dark outline of the trees, swaying gently in the breeze. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then, a soft knocking at the door. My heart skipped. It was just past midnight and no one should have been outside. I moved cautiously toward the door, hoping it was just someone from the town, maybe someone who had gotten lost in the snow. But when I opened it, there was no one there. I stepped outside, the cold biting at my skin, and looked around. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there at all. I checked the porch, shining my flashlight into the yard, but the only thing that greeted me was the endless expanse of snow-covered trees. As I stood there, puzzled, I heard the whispering again. Soft, indistinct voices carried by the wind. The air seemed heavier, as if the very night was holding its breath. I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. That wasn't the last time I heard those footsteps. The next day, Christmas Day, was when it all became worse. The house felt off. The usual warmth was gone. The fire crackled less and shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should. The laughter of my family felt distant, as if they were underwater. I tried to push away the thought that we weren't alone. But then, that evening, the knocking returned. Soft and measured, persistent. I couldn't ignore it this time. I grabbed a flashlight and approached the door, trembling. The snow was deeper now, the ground untouched by anyone since the night before. I couldn't see any footprints leading up to the house. As I opened the door, I saw him, the figure standing in the snow. His face was obscured by a ragged hood, and in his hand he clutched a sack. There was something unnaturally cold about him, something that made my breath catch. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. The sack in his hand moved slightly, like something was shifting inside it. I tried to look away, but his gaze seemed to pull me in, colder than the winter air around us. The whispering started again, soft and rhythmic. It wasn't words I could understand, but they seemed to echo in my mind. "Listen," they seemed to say, though no one spoke out loud. I shut the door, my hand trembling on the lock. I backed away from it, the knocking fading into silence. But I knew he was still there, watching from the other side. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the whispers, the soft, rhythmic sounds that seemed to echo through the house. I stared at the Christmas tree, its ornaments glowing dimly in the dark, when I noticed something odd. One of the ornaments was swinging, even though there was no breeze. I got up, my heart racing, and traced the motion. The figure, the one from outside, was standing just a few feet from me, its gaze fixed on the tree. His hollow eyes seemed to stare right through me, as though he was waiting for something. Then, in a voice that wasn't human, he spoke. "Why do you celebrate? Do you know the truth about this night?" I couldn't answer. My throat was dry and my mind was racing. What did he mean? Before I could even process what was happening, he vanished, leaving behind only silence and the faint echo of his whispers. Christmas Day ended in a cold haze, the shadow of that figure lingering in my thoughts. I haven't seen him since, but I can still hear the whispers on quiet nights, especially around Christmas. Maybe he was just a part of some dream, some nightmare brought on by too much solitude and cold. Or maybe, I still wonder, he was something else entirely, something that never left. It was a quiet night at the old cinema. I was the only one working, the projectionist. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The theater itself was a relic, built decades ago with worn-out seats and a projector that creaked like an old ship. The movies were rarely popular anymore, but the few people who still came were loyal, regulars who didn't seem to mind the dust and the dim lighting. I liked the quiet, the solitude. But tonight, something felt off. The last showing had ended hours ago, and now I was in the projection room, staring at the faint glow of the reel spinning. I was about to shut down the projector when I heard it, the faintest noise. A whisper, almost too soft to hear, coming from the hall below. I froze, listening. The theater had been empty for hours, or at least I thought it had. The whisper wasn't just in my head, it was real, distinct. It came again, a voice barely above a breath. "Help." I leaned closer to the edge of the projection room, peering down into the darkness. The hall was still. Nothing. My heart raced as I hesitated, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the whisper came again, louder this time. "Help. Please." It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it wasn't from the films either. It wasn't part of the stories on screen. My breath caught in my throat, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I descended the stairs slowly, every step echoing in the vast, empty space. The whispers continued, now more distinct. "I'm here. Please." I reached the main floor of the theater. The screen flickered faintly, casting long shadows in the dim light. The chairs were empty, just as they had been when the last film ended. Yet, the whispers came from the seats, as if someone, something, was sitting there. I moved cautiously toward the source of the voice. My eyes strained, trying to pierce the darkness. The whispers became clearer, more desperate. I can't get out." I turned my head, scanning the rows of seats, but saw no one. The whispers were getting louder, more insistent. They were coming from beneath one of the seats. Trembling, I knelt down and lifted the seat. Beneath it, there was nothing, only the cold, bare floor. But the whispers were louder now, echoing in my ears as if they had no source at all. Panic gripped me. I wanted to run, but something held me in place, rooted to the spot. The whispers didn't stop. "Help. Please." Then, suddenly, there was silence, complete and oppressive. My heart was hammering, and I clutched my chest, wondering if I'd imagined it all. That's when I saw it. A faint outline of a figure on the far side of the theater, barely illuminated by the screen. It was a shape, taller than a person, its form blending with the shadows. No face, just an empty void where eyes should be. Before I could react, the figure moved closer, drifting silently across the room. It didn't walk. It glided, like smoke being pulled through the air. My breath caught again, and I stumbled backward, my hand brushing against something cold. I turned, only to find an empty row of seats behind me. When I looked back, the figure was gone. The theater was still empty. The screen blinked, casting distorted reflections of the room onto itself, but the whispers had stopped. I didn't stay long after that. I locked up and left, never looking back. I never heard those whispers again. I had always been fascinated by the old house at the end of the street. It was a place I passed every day on my way home from school, its faded, peeling paint and overgrown yard standing out from the otherwise ordinary suburban neighborhood. No one lived there, or at least no one who was ever seen. The house seemed to exist in a quiet, unsettling limbo, untouched by time. One day, I found myself walking past it again, the sun sinking low behind the horizon. Curiosity got the better of me, and before I knew it, I found myself at the front gate. The rusted hinges creaked as I pushed it open, the weight of years shifting as the gate groaned in protest. I stepped into the yard, the grass crunching beneath my feet. The house loomed in front of me, its windows dark and lifeless. I had always heard stories about that house, whispers of strange sounds, of lights that flickered in the night, of shadows that moved in the windows when no one was supposed to be there. But I never believed in such things, at least not until that day. I approached the front door, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. I placed my hand on the doorknob, but it didn't turn. The door was locked. I sighed, feeling a twinge of disappointment, and stepped back. But then I noticed something. Movement from one of the upstairs windows. A shadow, shifting, just for a moment. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too human. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably just a trick of the light, something my mind conjured up in the dim twilight. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. Despite my better judgment, I approached the side of the house, creeping closer to a window that was partially cracked open. The boards covering it were old and warped, barely hanging on. I pressed my face to the opening, peering inside. The room beyond was dark, but I could make out the outlines of furniture, ancient, covered in dust. A faint glimmer of something metallic caught my eye, resting on a table. Suddenly, a low creak echoed from somewhere inside the house, and I jumped back, heart pounding. My breath quickened as I stepped away from the window, the realization hitting me that I wasn't alone. The silence seemed to stretch, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me. I had to get out, but just as I turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper, barely audible, as if it was coming from inside the house. "Stay." I froze, my blood running cold. The whisper wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't human. It was hollow, almost robotic, like something long forgotten had spoken from beyond the grave. A shiver ran down my spine. My feet felt frozen to the ground. I wanted to run, but something kept me rooted in place. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Stay." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to take a step back. I wanted to scream, but my voice felt caught in my throat. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but my body wouldn't move. I could feel the air grow heavier, darker, as though the house itself had become alive, watching me, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as the whispers had started, they stopped. The silence was deafening. I waited, my heart racing, my breaths shallow, trying to convince myself it was over. I turned, finally running, sprinting down the street, my mind replaying the voice in my head. I never went back to that house. To this day, I still wonder what was in there, what was waiting. But some things are better left untouched, hidden away, behind doors that should never be opened. I remember the night clearly, even though I wish I didn't. It wasn't like a typical horror story where something obvious happens and you can't look away. No, this was different. A quiet, unsettling terror that crept in slowly, unnoticed, until it was already too late. It started with an evening trip. A group of us decided to go for a hike up an old, abandoned mountain trail that no one in town really talked about anymore. The path was barely visible through the trees, and we figured it'd be fun to explore something that felt off the map. No one else had been there in years, from what we'd heard. The trail wasn't difficult at first, just some rocky terrain and patches of overgrown bushes. But as we kept walking deeper into the forest, something felt off. The air seemed thick, heavier. The usual sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves were replaced by a strange, oppressive silence. Even the forest itself felt strange, like it was watching us. We had been hiking for what felt like hours when we came across a clearing, a wide space surrounded by towering pines. There was an old, crumbling structure at the center of the clearing. It looked like a small, forgotten cabin, its roof partially caved in, and the walls worn with age. None of us had expected to find something like this out here. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. "We should check it out," one of my friends, Mark, said, stepping toward the cabin. The others hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. The closer we got, the more uneasy I became. The silence seemed to thicken, as though the forest itself had swallowed all sound. The door of the cabin creaked open under our weight, revealing a room filled with dust-covered furniture and remnants of something long forgotten. We stepped inside, hesitant, but everything seemed still. There was nothing alive inside except for us. As we poked around, one of my friends, Laura, pointed out something strange. The walls were covered in old, faded drawings. Children's drawings, but they weren't the usual cheerful, innocent sketches. These were distorted, eerie, figures with hollow eyes, twisted shapes, and scribbled faces that seemed to stare at us from the faded paper. "That's creepy," Mark said, turning pale. We quickly decided to leave, but as we stepped outside, the feeling of unease only deepened. It wasn't just the creepy drawings or the old decaying cabin. It was something else. A presence. It wasn't threatening, but there was an undeniable sense that we weren't supposed to be there. We moved quickly through the woods, trying to shake the sense of discomfort that had settled over us. The trail became steeper, harder to follow as we pressed on, and the oppressive silence grew even thicker. Then, as we were about to turn back, we heard it, the soft sound of footsteps behind us. But there was no one there. "Guys, stop," I whispered, turning around. The others froze. "I hear it too," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps echoed faintly in the distance, like someone, or something, was walking just beyond the tree line, following us. We hurried, but the sound seemed to be growing closer, as though whatever was following us was keeping pace. No matter how far we went, the noise remained, distant but persistent. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we finally reached the trailhead, we stopped, breathing heavily. The trees loomed around us, shadows stretching long in the fading light. That's when I realized something was missing. One of my friends, Emma, was gone. "Where's Emma?" I asked, my voice trembling. The others looked at each other, panic setting in. We split up, calling her name, but the only response was silence. The woods had swallowed her, leaving us alone once again. We couldn't find Emma. We never did. She was just gone. There was no trace of her, no sign of where she might have gone. The forest had taken her, and we were too afraid to go back in and search again. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that something was in those woods, something that watched us, followed us, and took Emma. And whatever it was, I'm convinced it's still out there, waiting. It was supposed to be just an ordinary day at home. The house sat on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by open fields and woods that stretched for miles in every direction. I lived alone, but I wasn't one to feel uneasy about the quiet, isolated life. At least, I wasn't until that day. The morning started off normal, just another day of cleaning, catching up on emails, and preparing for the usual chores. But something about the air felt off. It wasn't heavy or oppressive, just different. I shook it off, attributing it to the weather. Maybe the storm they'd predicted was finally rolling in. Around noon, the rain began, soft at first, but growing stronger by the hour. I watched it from the kitchen window, sipping my coffee. The sky was a thick, dull gray, and everything beyond the yard blurred under the falling sheets. I didn't think much of it until I heard the knock. It came softly at first, 3 quick raps on the front door. I froze, my coffee halfway to my lips. The knocking came again, a bit louder this time, persistent, but no one ever showed themselves. I told myself it was probably just someone needing shelter from the storm. Maybe a neighbor, though no one I recognized. I stood in front of the door, heart hammering, and cracked it open just a little. No one was there. I peered outside into the rain, but the porch was empty. There was no one around, just the relentless downpour and the empty, soaking fields beyond. I checked the locks and decided to ignore it. Must have been my imagination, I told myself. Storms can mess with your head. I went back to the living room, the chill of the rain beginning to seep into my bones. The windows fogged up as the rain continued to fall harder. The noise outside grew louder, the steady pitter-patter of droplets becoming a relentless pounding. It was soothing in a way, like the world was washing away everything around me. Hours passed. I lost track of time, engrossed in some half-read book, when a sudden noise made my blood run cold. A slow, scraping sound came from the back of the house, faint but deliberate, like something dragging across the floor. My stomach clenched and I sat there, frozen, waiting. The scraping grew louder. It wasn't coming from the window or the door, but from deeper inside the house. The kind of sound that made you wonder how something could even move like that. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, maybe some loose shutter flapping against the wall, but the wind doesn't scrape like that. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and moved cautiously toward the source of the noise. Each step felt heavier, each breath quieter. The scraping continued, rhythmic, unnerving. I reached the hallway leading to the back of the house and shined my light down the dark corridor. That's when I saw it. A figure hunched over and shuffling, moving towards the kitchen. Its back was grotesquely twisted and its arms were far too long, dragging along the floor. I couldn't make out a face, just dark voids where eyes should have been, and something glistening at the corners of its mouth. Panic surged through me, but I didn't scream. I couldn't move. My legs refused to obey, frozen in place as the thing advanced. The scraping stopped, replaced by a low, raspy breathing that seemed to echo through the house. Then it stopped. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, I could feel its presence just a few feet away, as if it had paused, waiting for something. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing through the quiet. Who's there? I managed to whisper, but my voice barely escaped. Silence. Another long minute passed, the air thick with dread. I couldn't hear anything but the sound of my own breathing and the relentless rain outside. Slowly, cautiously, I backed away, retracing my steps. The figure never followed. I didn't hear it leave. But when I checked the back door, the lock was undone. I didn't sleep that night, clutching my phone tightly, waiting for dawn. The storm raged on, but whatever had been there, watching, had never come back. It started with a simple drive. I had always been fascinated by old lighthouses, drawn to their solitude and the stories they seemed to hold. So, one weekend, I decided to take a trip to an isolated one perched on a cliff by the sea. It was something I'd always wanted to do, something to escape from the noise of daily life. The lighthouse was miles away from any town or signs of human life. The drive to get there was long, winding through narrow, desolate roads with nothing but trees and rocky cliffs on either side. The closer I got, the more the world seemed to shrink. By the time I arrived, the sun had begun to set, casting a long, eerie glow over the water below. The lighthouse stood tall, its white paint peeling and windows dark. The air smelled of salt and brine, and the only sound was the crashing waves below. I parked my car and began the short hike up the steep path leading to the base of the lighthouse. The only other thing besides the distant roar of the sea was the silence that seemed to engulf everything. When I reached the entrance, I pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside was musty and cold, with narrow, spiraling stairs leading to the top. Each step groaned beneath my feet as I climbed. It wasn't long before I reached the top where the view was breathtaking. The sea stretched out before me, endless and unforgiving. I stood there, lost in the beauty of it all, when something made me glance back toward the stairs. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing there, silhouetted against the narrow frame of the doorway. My stomach twisted and my heart skipped a beat. But when I turned fully around, there was no one there. I told myself it was just the shadows playing tricks. The wind whistled through the small broken windows, and I shivered, forcing the creeping unease to the back of my mind. As I took in the view again, I thought about the stories of ships lost at sea, the lonely keepers who had watched from these towers for generations. The idea of isolation felt comforting until I realized that I wasn't alone. Not truly. There was something off about the silence, the absence of birds, the usual sounds of life. Everything was too still, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. I made my way back down the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath me echoing. When I reached the bottom, the door was shut. How had I not noticed that before? The door hadn't moved on its own. My heart raced again as I reached for the handle, only to find it locked from the inside. I was trapped. Panic hit me hard. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The lighthouse stood in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but ocean and cliffs. I tried to open the door, banging on it, shouting for help, but there was no one around. The sound of my own voice felt hollow in the empty space. I spent what felt like hours trying to find a way out, but the door refused to budge. It was as if something had sealed it behind me, something I couldn't see or understand. The fear grew, sinking into every part of me. The thought that I might be trapped here, in this ancient lighthouse where the echoes of the past lingered, was too much to bear. When I finally slumped to the floor, exhausted and hopeless, I noticed something strange. The silence seemed to have shifted. Not just quiet, it was as if the world itself had grown quieter. The air was still, heavy, as though time had stopped. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, when I heard it. The faint sound of a distant bell, soft and low. It wasn't coming from inside the lighthouse. It was from the sea. The bell rang again, louder this time. It echoed off the cliffs, and I couldn't tell if it was real or some strange, haunting memory. My stomach turned as I realized there was no ship in sight, no boat or rescue, just the sound of a bell calling from the void. Trembling, I stood up and went to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass. Below, far out on the water, I saw a flicker of light, dim, almost ghostly. It moved closer, but the lighthouse had no boats or ships. No life should have been out there. I forced myself to look away, but the bell continued, growing louder and more insistent. I didn't know if it was real, or if my mind was playing tricks, but I knew one thing. The lighthouse wasn't just keeping watch over the sea. It felt like the sea was watching me. I never saw anyone outside, never found a way out. But the bell still echoes in my mind, always just out of reach. I don't know if anyone else heard it, or if I was the only one who ever would. It was the middle of summer when a group of friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to a nearby lake. None of us had ever been there before, but the promise of clear waters and warm sun was too tempting to pass up. The drive wasn't long, just far enough to feel like we were escaping the noise of the city, but not so far that we'd lose cell service. The day started perfectly. We arrived early, claiming a spot near the shore, and spent the afternoon swimming, laughing, and basking in the sunlight. The lake was calm, almost unnaturally so. The water was glassy and there wasn't a single ripple. It was eerie in its stillness, but we were too preoccupied with the warmth and the relaxation to give it much thought. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the water, we decided to go for one last swim before the evening cooled. The water was still as we dove in, and it felt refreshing. The perfect end to a perfect day. But as I swam further out, the light from the setting sun began to fade, and the water became darker. That's when I noticed something strange beneath me. It wasn't an object or a shadow. It was a presence. Something shifted below the surface, too far down for me to make out. My stomach twisted and I stopped swimming, treading water as my eyes strained into the depths. There was nothing visibly there, but I could feel it. A sensation like being watched, like something was studying me from beneath. "Hey," I called out to my friends, trying to hide the unease in my voice. "Can you guys feel that? Like something's down there?" They splashed and joked, completely unaware. I didn't tell them how much I wanted to get out of the water. The longer I stayed, the stronger the feeling grew. It was as if the lake itself had become a living, breathing entity, waiting. I swam back to shore, hurried and shaking off the cold, unsure if what I had felt was real. The others were still laughing, throwing a frisbee, soaking up the last of the day's warmth. I tried to forget about the sensation and told myself it was just my nerves playing tricks. As we started packing up to leave, I noticed something odd in the sand near our stuff. Tracks. Not footprints, though. Drag marks, deep and deliberate, leading from the water toward the woods. My heart stopped as I followed them with my eyes. They disappeared into the trees, where there was nothing but silence. I didn't say anything to my friends. I couldn't bring myself to. As we drove away, I kept looking back at the lake, the sun now fully set, casting a dark, brooding reflection. That night, I couldn't sleep. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I kept wondering, what was in that water? And whatever it was it still down there, waiting for us to return? I don't remember how I ended up on the hiking trail that day. I'd never been much of an outdoors person, but something about the open air and quiet drew me there. My plan had been simple. Spend the afternoon walking along a familiar trail, clear my head, and get away from everything for a while. It wasn't a popular trail, tucked deep into the mountains where few people dared to venture. I'd come across it a few times before, but never explored it fully. The sun was high, casting long shadows through the dense trees. The air was crisp, the kind of silence that wraps around you and feels endless. I walked for hours, following the winding trail deeper into the woods, never thinking twice about turning back. It felt peaceful. Too peaceful. The absence of birds, the quiet rustling of leaves. The trail was so isolated I almost expected to hear nothing at all. But still, something nagged at the back of my mind. It was as if the woods themselves were watching. Eventually, I found myself standing at a fork in the path. One side led to a steep incline, the other seemed to stretch on toward the valley below. Without hesitation, I chose the incline, curious about where it might lead. It wasn't until I'd climbed what felt like hours that I realized I was well beyond any familiar landmarks. I told myself to turn back, but something kept me going. The air became colder as I ascended, the trees growing denser. The trail became narrower, and I started to notice strange markings on the bark of the trees. Scratches, like someone had carved symbols into the wood. I brushed them off as some random hiker's curiosity, but there was a pattern, one I couldn't quite place. The farther I went, the quieter it became, until even my own footsteps seemed to echo unnaturally. That's when I heard it. A faint, hollow whisper, like the wind carrying someone else's voice. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was no wind, no breeze. The air was still. "Help me," the voice said, barely audible. It was distant, but clear. I stood there, my skin crawling as I listened. My heart raced, but I couldn't move. "Help me," the voice repeated, louder this time. It wasn't coming from any particular direction. It was all around me. Panic surged through my chest and I turned to run, only to trip over something in the undergrowth. My flashlight bounced away, leaving me in darkness. The woods felt alive, shifting around me as though they were watching, waiting. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed my phone, only to find there was no signal. The darkness felt heavier now, oppressive, like the trees were closing in. My breath came in short gasps as I tried to steady myself. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. Just silence, except for that whisper growing closer now, louder, echoing in my ears. "Help me." I turned, panic turning my vision blurry as I saw a figure, tall, gaunt, and pale, standing at the edge of the trail. Its features were obscured by the shadows, but I could feel its hollow gaze fixated on me. I backed away, my hands shaking, but it didn't move. It just stood there, watching. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was begging. I turned and ran, faster than I'd ever run before, dodging branches and tripping over rocks. The whisper followed me, always just a step behind. The path seemed endless, the trees shifting and bending as if to block my way. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled into an open clearing. The sky above me was dark, stars faintly visible through a break in the trees. My chest heaved as I collapsed to the ground, trembling. The whisper had stopped, but I knew it wasn't over. When I looked back, the figure was gone. The woods were still, too still. I wanted to stay there, but I couldn't. I forced myself to my feet and followed the path I had come from. I kept walking until I saw the faint outline of the trailhead. As I stepped out into the open, the first light of dawn touched the horizon. I could still feel it, though. The heavy weight of the woods, like something was watching, waiting, still following me. And even now, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there. It was a quiet Sunday evening when my family decided to take a drive out to the old lake. The air was crisp, the sky painted with soft hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The lake had always been a place of peace, a spot where we'd spent countless weekends, swimming, fishing, and simply enjoying the stillness. We packed a small cooler, grabbed some snacks, and set out in the late afternoon. The drive was familiar, the roads winding and quiet, with only the occasional passing car. As we approached the lake, something felt different. The usual sense of tranquility was replaced by a strange feeling of isolation. We parked near the water's edge, the gravel crunching beneath our tires. The lake stretched out before us, its surface calm and glassy. My parents unpacked the cooler while my younger siblings ran ahead, eager to dip their toes into the chilly water. I stayed back, sitting on the hood of the car, watching them. The sun had almost fully set now, casting long shadows across the trees that framed the lake. There was something in those shadows that didn't feel right. A stillness, unnatural, almost as if the world had stopped turning. That's when I heard it. A soft whisper carried on the wind. It was faint, almost inaudible, but I could feel its pull. My head snapped toward the woods behind the lake. There was no one there, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the wind or my imagination. But the longer I sat there, the more the feeling of being watched intensified. My parents were still chatting by the car, unaware of the unease that had settled over me. I got up and walked toward the water's edge, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were clearer now, though they seemed to come from nowhere. I kept turning in circles, looking around, but there was no one. "Hey," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" Silence. But then I noticed something strange. Footprints leading down toward the water. They weren't ours. They were small, almost childlike, but the stride was too long, too deliberate. My stomach twisted as I followed the prints, tracing them with my eyes. They led from the trees, right to the edge of the water, then disappeared into the still lake. A shiver ran down my spine and I turned back toward my family. My younger siblings had stopped playing and now stood beside our parents, their eyes wide with confusion. They hadn't noticed the footprints, but I could feel their presence. Something was watching us from the trees, something that didn't belong. "Let's go," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." We hurried back to the car, the unease now overwhelming. I didn't dare look back, but the whispers followed us, trailing through the trees like whispers of something long gone. As we drove away from the lake, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those childlike footprints, soaked in water, following us. But they were gone. To this day, I still wonder about that evening. The lake has always been a place of peace, but something had lingered there. Something we couldn't see, but that made its presence known. The whispers still echo in my memory, though I haven't heard them since, and I doubt I ever will again. It was a quiet, ordinary Friday night. I worked at a small local museum, one of those places with dim lighting and long hallways filled with ancient artifacts. The building had a certain charm to it, but by night it felt hollow, lifeless, like the stories of the past were fading into silence. My shift was from midnight to 8 a.m., and most nights were uneventful, just me and the quiet hum of security cameras. That night, everything was routine as usual. I walked through the galleries, checking the displays, making sure everything was locked up tight. The only sounds were the creak of my footsteps and the faint echo of the security system beeping softly. Around 2 a.m., I was in the main hall near the old exhibit on ancient civilizations. The air felt heavy, like it had been pulled from somewhere deep beneath the earth. The lights flickered once, briefly, and then returned to their usual dull glow. I shrugged it off, assuming it was the building settling. I glanced at the case with the ancient pottery, its intricate designs worn from years of dust and time. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the display cases was cracked open, my stomach twisted. These cases were made to be impossible to open without the alarm system triggering. The glass wasn't shattered, it was simply opened, carefully. I approached, my breath quickening. The artifact inside, the ancient stone mask, was gone. In its place was nothing but empty air. I called security immediately, my voice shaky. The line crackled, but no one answered. I wandered through the museum, heart pounding as I checked each exhibit. One by one, I realized others had been tampered with. A display of ancient scrolls was wide open, the texts scattered on the floor. A case housing old coins was now empty. The more I walked, the more I noticed. Every artifact was either disturbed or missing. Panic set in. What was happening? Someone had broken in, but there were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of where they'd gone. I turned a corner and froze. The security camera feed on the wall was glitching, the screen flickering wildly. I stared at the screen, my breath catching. The camera wasn't showing the empty hallways it should have been. Instead, I could see something else. In the grainy, distorted feed, I saw figures. Tall, shadowy figures walking through the museum. They moved silently like they were gliding rather than walking. Their faces were obscured, but I knew instinctively they were not human. One of them stopped in front of the empty display case where the ancient mask had been. The figure tilted its head as if inspecting the empty space. Then it turned slowly, as though it could feel my gaze, and began walking toward the camera. The screen went black. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. There was no one to call, no one who could help me. I could feel them in the museum, moving through the darkened halls like ghosts. As I stood frozen, trying to comprehend what I had just witnessed, I noticed something else. The air was colder now, colder than it had any right to be, considering the time of year. The faint sound of whispers filled the stillness, voices murmuring in languages I couldn't understand. I wanted to run, but every instinct told me that running wouldn't help. They were already here. I kept walking, trying to find an escape, but everywhere I went, the shadows followed. I realized, too late, that the missing artifacts weren't random. They were gone. Stolen by the figures that had emerged from some forgotten part of the museum. Then I heard a voice. It wasn't from the shadows or from the air. It was behind me, right beside me. return what was taken. I turned around, but there was nothing there. No one. No sound, except for the whispers, still echoing from the darkness. I didn't know if I was losing my mind, but I knew I couldn't stay. I rushed out of the museum, sprinting into the night, my breath visible in the cold air. The police came later, of course. They found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone breaking in. The artifacts were never recovered, and the museum remained silent. They assumed someone had broken in and escaped, but I knew the truth. Whatever those things were, whatever had taken the artifacts, they were still there, waiting. I've never gone back to that museum, and I never will. I had always loved the quiet solitude of the forest. Growing up, I would spend hours walking through the trees, lost in my thoughts, letting the sounds of nature calm my mind. But that day, something felt different, off in a way I couldn't explain. It was mid-afternoon when I decided to take a long hike. The weather was perfect, warm, sunny, with only a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. I parked my car at the edge of the trailhead and started walking, following the familiar path that twisted deeper into the woods. The forest felt vast and peaceful, as it always did, but today there was a strange stillness. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just silence that seemed unnatural. After about an hour, I came to a clearing, a large, flat expanse of moss-covered ground surrounded by towering trees. I decided to stop there and rest for a while. I lay back on a bed of soft grass, staring up at the sky through the canopy of leaves. As I lay there, I noticed something strange. The sounds of the forest had stopped entirely. Not just birds, but everything. It was as if the entire world had gone silent. My heart began to pound as I sat up and looked around. The air felt heavy, like something was looming just beyond my view. I stood and started walking again, though my sense of peace was gone. The silence wasn't just unnerving, it felt wrong. I felt like something was watching me, like the forest wasn't supposed to be this quiet. My footsteps became quicker, my breathing faster. Hours seemed to pass, though I wasn't sure how much time had actually gone by. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I knew I needed to turn back, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. As I walked, I came to a narrow footbridge over a shallow creek. I hesitated before stepping onto it, the creaking wood beneath my feet making me pause. The water below was eerily still, almost too still. I looked down into the water, but there was nothing there. No fish, no movement at all. The reflection staring back at me wasn't quite right either, distorted as if the water itself was not quite real. It wasn't until I reached the other side that I realized how quiet the creek had been. There wasn't even the sound of flowing water. I shook my head, trying to push away the sense of dread that was creeping up on me. The trees seemed to close in around me as I continued walking. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing against my shoulders, the stillness pressing into my ears. It wasn't just quiet. It felt like something was missing from the world. The forest wasn't supposed to feel this way, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. I began to run, though my legs ached. My breath came in ragged gasps. The forest around me seemed to blur, the shadows twisting and shifting unnaturally. I wasn't sure if it was my fear playing tricks on me or if something was actually happening. And then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard it. A soft, raspy whisper, closer than I expected. My legs locked up, my body frozen as I stood there in the dark, unable to move. The whisper repeated itself, louder now, closer, like someone or something was right behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body refused to obey. The whisper stopped, but the silence that followed was even more deafening. I felt a chill run down my spine, as if the very air had grown colder. I could hear footsteps now, slow, deliberate, just behind me. I didn't dare look back. Every instinct screamed at me to move, but I stood there, trembling. It wasn't until the whisper returned, right next to my ear, that I broke free from the paralysis. I bolted down the trail, my legs moving as fast as they could carry me. The trees blurred past in a chaotic rush, my breath ragged, lungs burning. I didn't stop until I broke through the tree line and saw my car in the distance. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking, but I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was safely inside, the engine roaring to life beneath me. As I drove away from the forest, I realized that I didn't know what had followed me, or why, but something had, and it still felt like it was out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting. It was a quiet evening, and I was driving down a deserted highway, the kind where the road stretches endlessly with nothing but fields and trees on either side. I had been driving for hours, heading home after a long trip, and the dim glow of my headlights was the only source of light in the endless blackness around me. The air was thick with the scent of rain, though no storms had come. The tires hummed on the road, and the only sound was the rhythmic click of the wipers clearing the occasional drops from my windshield. I hadn't seen another car in hours, not since leaving the last town, and I felt that familiar sense of isolation creeping in. As I turned a bend, the first thing I noticed was the old wooden sign. It was weathered and barely legible, but I could make out the faint outline of the words, Eagle Point, 5 miles. I didn't remember seeing a town named Eagle Point on any map, but the sign wasn't particularly unusual, just another small forgotten place along this endless stretch of road. I was tempted to speed up, eager to get home, but something about that sign pulled me in. Curiosity, maybe, or the strange sense of solitude that had settled over the drive. I took a slow turn down the narrow, winding road that led toward Eagle Point. As I approached, the first thing I noticed was how dark everything had become. The streetlights in this part of the country were practically non-existent. The only light came from the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the night. Eagle Point wasn't much of a town. A few houses stood in various states of disrepair, the yards overgrown and dotted with wildflowers and weeds. There was no one outside, no cars, no movement, just a stillness that seemed to stretch forever. I drove slowly through the quiet streets, my senses on edge. That's when I saw the church. It wasn't like the other buildings. It was old, its steeple towering above the others, casting long, dark shadows across the ground. There was something unsettling about it, the way the windows reflected the light like hollow, staring eyes. I slowed down and parked across the street, unsure of why I felt so drawn to it. I stepped out of my car and walked toward the church. The ground was soft beneath my feet, the sound of crunching gravel echoing in the stillness. The door creaked open slightly as I pushed it, revealing the dim interior. Dust motes floated in the air, catching the faint light from my phone. The pews were empty, and the air smelled musty, old. The silence felt heavier here. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, like the church itself was holding its breath, waiting. I wandered further inside, drawn by an odd sense of fascination and dread. In one corner of the church, there was an old faded photo framed and sitting atop a small altar. It depicted a group of people, women, men, and children, standing together, smiling. But their eyes were empty, vacant. As I stared at the photo, I felt my skin crawl. The stillness grew deeper, more suffocating. Then, from the back of the church, I heard it. A faint whisper, too soft to understand, but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat and I turned slowly, heart pounding. There was nothing there, just shadows in the corners, stretching and shifting. I backed away from the altar toward the door. That's when I noticed something strange. The photo was gone. In its place was another photo, newly placed on the altar. This one showed me, alone, standing by my car with an empty, hollow stare. Panic gripped me as I snatched the photo and backed toward the door. The whispering had grown louder now, echoing through the church like 1,000 voices speaking at once. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was haunting. I stumbled outside, the door slamming behind me. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, my heart racing like it might burst. I drove as fast as I could, eyes locked on the road ahead. When I finally dared to look back, the church was gone, just empty fields stretching into the void. I never went back. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or heard. All I know is that some places aren't meant to be revisited. Some places leave you changed, and some places never really leave at all. It was a hot summer evening, and I had decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. The sun had set hours ago, leaving behind a deep, velvety darkness that seemed to stretch forever. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of a porch light, casting long shadows down the sidewalks. I lived in an old, quiet, suburban neighborhood that had once been bustling, but now felt hollow and deserted. Most of the houses were dark, their windows blank and lifeless. As I walked, I noticed the silence. No chirping of crickets, no rustling leaves. It was unnaturally still. The only sounds were the faint echoes of my own footsteps against the cracked pavement. Halfway through my walk, I noticed something off about the house 2 doors down from mine. Its porch light was flickering, buzzing faintly, like it couldn't quite decide if it wanted to be on or off. The windows were dark, and there was a strange emptiness to the place, as if the house itself had been abandoned long ago. But the most unsettling part was the shape standing by the front door. A tall, thin figure cloaked in shadow. At first, I thought it was just the edge of a tree or a dark outline of the house, but then I saw it move. Slowly, deliberately. The figure didn't seem human. It wasn't walking like someone lost or wandering. It moved with purpose, as if it were waiting, watching for something. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't look away, even though every part of me wanted to turn and run. I wanted to shout, to call out, but something held me frozen in place. The figure tilted its head, staring in my direction. I could barely make out its outline, but there was something deeply unsettling about it, the way it stood so still, yet seemed entirely aware of my presence. Slowly, it began to move towards me, taking long, measured steps. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to scream, to flee, but my legs refused to move. I was trapped, rooted to the spot. The figure was almost close enough to make out its features when suddenly, without warning, it stopped. It stood there, facing me, just a few yards away. The silence stretched so thick I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Then, without any discernible reason, the figure spoke. Its voice was low, almost mechanical, like it had been recorded and played back. "You should not be here." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. I tried to take a step backward, but my body wouldn't move. The figure began to step closer again, and I could feel my panic rising. It tilted its head again, tilting toward me as if it was studying something. Then, almost too quietly to hear, it whispered, "You should have left already." Suddenly, everything snapped back into focus. My legs moved on their own, and I bolted down the street, adrenaline coursing through me. I didn't look back, not once, until I was safely back home, slamming the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The figure's words haunted me. I don't know what it was or what it wanted, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't human, and I pray I never see it again. I've always loved the quiet of the night. There's something about the stillness that feels peaceful, calming. A few months ago, I took a spontaneous trip to an old abandoned lighthouse perched on the edge of the coast. It wasn't a typical tourist spot, more of a forgotten relic. The lighthouse had been decommissioned years ago, left to crumble under the weight of time and the sea breeze. My friends had backed out, calling the idea too weird, but I was drawn to the solitude. I set out around sunset, carrying only a flashlight and a small backpack with a few essentials. The hike to the lighthouse was long, winding along cliffs that dropped off into the endless ocean below. As I climbed higher, the world seemed to shrink, the noises of civilization fading away. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving a trail of pink and orange across the sky. By the time I reached the lighthouse, night had fully taken hold. The structure was towering and silent, its paint chipped and its windows broken. I stood there for a while, taking it all in. It felt like stepping back in time, a place that had been abandoned long before I'd arrived. Inside the lighthouse was just as I imagined, cold and damp, with old wooden beams groaning under the weight of neglect. The air was thick with the smell of mildew. I climbed up the narrow spiral staircase to the top, each creak of the old wooden steps echoing in the empty tower. At the top, the view was breathtaking. The ocean stretched out in every direction, the moonlight casting a silver sheen over the waves. I settled in on the edge of the platform, staring out at the horizon, lost in thought. The silence was almost deafening. There was no wind, no crashing waves, just stillness. I was about to close my eyes when I heard it, a faint, distant cry. It was soft, almost like a whisper carried by the wind, but not quite. I froze. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it. Another cry followed, closer this time. My heart started to race. It wasn't human, not exactly, but it felt close. The sound was strange, almost like a mix of a scream and a moan, drifting up from the base of the lighthouse. I climbed down the stairs slowly, every creak echoing louder than before. I kept my flashlight aimed down, scanning the shadows as I went. The sound seemed to be coming from below, beneath the lighthouse. It wasn't an animal, not the wind. It was something else entirely. When I reached the bottom, the cries had stopped. The air felt colder, more oppressive. I walked around the structure, flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The silence returned, almost suffocating. That's when I noticed something in the corner of my eye. Movement. A figure stood just at the edge of the cliff, barely visible in the dark. I squinted, but they didn't move. They were watching, unmoving, just standing there. My breath hitched as I pointed the flashlight toward them. For a moment, I thought it was a person, but there was something off. The figure wasn't human. The light only illuminated their outline, distorted and strange, as if they didn't belong in this world. Panic clawed at me. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the loose gravel. I didn't stop until I reached the car, my chest heaving with each breath. When I glanced back at the lighthouse, it was silent. The figure was gone. I still don't know what I saw that night. All I know is, I never returned to the lighthouse. Some things are better left untouched, left to the silence and the darkness where they belong. I still can't forget that night in the abandoned subway station. It was supposed to be a routine trip home after a long day, but everything felt off from the moment I stepped onto the platform. I had just missed the last train, so I found myself alone in the dim light of the old station. The air was thick with dust, the kind of silence that feels almost oppressive. There wasn't a soul in sight, and even the usual sounds of distant trains were absent. The station had a strange, heavy atmosphere, as though the city itself had forgotten about it. I sat down on the platform bench, my phone dimming as I glanced at it. No signal. I sighed, slipping it back into my pocket. That's when I noticed the flickering lights. The fluorescent bulbs hummed and flickered, casting distorted shadows that danced across the tiles. The whole place felt like it was slipping into another dimension. Time passed, or at least it felt like it did. The stillness stretched on and the silence grew deeper. Then I heard something, a soft, dragging noise echoing from somewhere deeper into the station. It was slow, uneven, like someone was shuffling along the tiles. I froze, straining my ears. The sound grew louder, closer. I should have left, but something kept me there, my fear rooted in place. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then I saw it, a figure. It was tall, gaunt, and moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. Its face was obscured by a shadow, but I could see the unsettling way it tilted its head as if listening. The closer it came, the more I realized its footsteps didn't match any human pattern. They were uneven, like someone dragging something heavy behind them. I wanted to scream, but my throat was locked in place. I couldn't look away as the figure got closer. It wasn't until it was right in front of me that I saw it. A faint, hollow glow where its eyes should have been. The smell hit me first. Something rotten and metallic. The silence broke into a low, distorted whisper, like the sound of something ancient and wrong. "Leave," it rasped, its voice sounding almost mechanical. "Not supposed to be here." In that moment, every instinct in my body screamed to run, but when I turned to flee, my legs buckled beneath me. The creature was gone, vanished like a memory. The subway station was still and empty once more, the lights flickering as though nothing had ever happened. I got up and made my way to the edge of the platform, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my home. Even now, I wonder what I saw that night, and whether it's still waiting for someone else to stumble into the darkness. The day had been perfect. We set out in the early afternoon to visit a small, desolate lake hidden deep in the hills. It wasn't a place anyone went often. Locals didn't talk about it much. My friends and I had stumbled upon it once before during a hike, and something about the isolation drew us back. The drive was long and winding, and by the time we arrived, the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees. The lake was peaceful, the water shimmering under the fading light. We were the only ones there, and it felt like our own private sanctuary. We unpacked our things, set up our chairs, and cracked open a few beers. The air was still and cool, but something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The silence wasn't natural. There was a kind of tension in the air that made the back of my neck prickle. I shrugged it off, assuming I was just imagining things. We spent a few hours lounging by the water, laughing, talking about nothing in particular. The stillness of the lake seemed to stretch endlessly in front of us, but with each passing hour, the quiet felt less like a serene escape and more like something was watching from beyond. It wasn't until the sun had fully set that things began to feel wrong. The faintest whisper of a breeze started stirring the surface of the water, creating ripples that seemed to echo far too loudly in the quiet. The shadows stretched longer, and we started to hear distant noises. Something scraping, dragging, far in the woods. My friends didn't seem bothered, but I felt my stomach knot. I tried to dismiss the feeling as nerves from being so isolated, but something in the air felt wrong. Every so often I'd glance toward the tree line, expecting to see someone or something. But there was nothing. Just trees, silent and still. As the last bit of light faded, we all decided it was time to head back. The trip back was uneventful, and we didn't talk much. The tension between us palpable. It wasn't until we were far away from the lake that things got truly strange. That's when my phone buzzed. A text popped up. "I'm still there." I froze. My heart began to pound as I looked around the car. No one else had mentioned anything about sending a text. I quickly unlocked my phone to check who it was from. The message wasn't from any of my friends. It was a number I didn't recognize. "I'm still there," it read again. My breath hitched as I realized the sender wasn't just talking about the lake. They were still there. I looked out the window, my eyes scanning the dark fields and forests rushing past. But there was no one. No car following us. No signs of movement. Just the empty, winding road. My phone buzzed once more, and this time the message read, "I've been following you since the lake." I clenched the steering wheel tighter. My mind raced. I wanted to believe it was some kind of prank, but deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. My friends hadn't received any message like that. No one could have known we were at the lake. We pulled over at a small, desolate gas station on the edge of town. The place was eerily quiet, and the flickering neon sign seemed to reflect the same unsettling silence from earlier. I stepped out, trying to shake off the creeping paranoia, but the world outside felt off. As I filled the gas tank, I kept glancing back toward the car, waiting for something. Anything. A noise from behind made me whip around. Nothing. But I could swear someone was watching from the darkened edge of the forest. Their shadows stretched impossibly long under the gas station's weak lights. I hurried back to the car, my phone gripped tightly in my hand. As I slid into the driver's seat, my heart skipped a beat when the screen lit up again. I'm still here. This time, the message came with a photo, one of the lake. But it wasn't the peaceful image we remembered. The water was dark, and in the distance, barely visible in the fading light, something moved, something tall and unnatural. The last message followed. I'll be with you, always. I never looked back as I drove. I couldn't. I never believed in the old tales they told about the abandoned factory. It was a relic of the past, a place everyone in town seemed to avoid. Rumors of shadows, whispers, and things that went bump in the night had always seemed like just that. Rumors. But I was never one to fear the unknown, at least not until that night. I had always heard stories from my parents and older folks about the factory. How it had been shut down decades ago after a series of strange occurrences, machinery running on its own, lights flickering and whispers echoing through the empty halls. But no one I knew had actually dared to enter it until that night. It was a few weeks after the factory officially closed down for good, and curiosity got the better of me. A few friends and I decided to explore. The building was towering, windows shattered, rusted beams sagging. The front doors creaked as we pushed them open, the air inside heavy with the scent of decay. We stepped cautiously through the dimly lit corridors, flashlight beams cutting through the thick shadows. We wandered through empty hallways filled with old machinery, cracked concrete, and scattered bits of broken equipment. It was like walking through the echoes of the past. The deeper we went, the quieter everything became. I started feeling like we were being watched. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was just the echoes of our own footsteps. We stopped in what once must have been a break room. A long, faded table sat in the center, surrounded by chairs that looked like they hadn't been used in years. The silence in the room was oppressive. I could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above us, barely hanging on. That's when it started. The faint whispering. It was so soft at first, barely audible, like someone was talking just on the edge of hearing. I froze, trying to make sense of it, but the others didn't seem to notice. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the wind, the old building settling, but the whispers didn't fade. If anything, they grew louder, more distinct. I took a step toward the hallway, my friends still gathered around the table. The whispers were clearer now, and they sounded wrong. It was like they weren't coming from anywhere. The words were faint, but they seemed to be repeating the same thing over and over, like a distorted echo. Leave. 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 I tried to call out to my friends, but the words caught in my throat. My flashlight flickered, then died completely. Panic gripped me as I scrambled to replace the batteries, but my hands were trembling so badly I could barely manage. Guys, I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. We need to get out of here. I heard a low, raspy laugh behind me, cold and hollow. My blood ran cold. I turned around slowly, expecting to see one of my friends, but there was no one there. The whispers had stopped, but the air grew colder. I could feel a presence in the room now, something that wasn't human. I heard it then. The faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward me from the hall. They weren't my friends' footsteps. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The sound grew louder, closer, until I could feel the vibrations in the floor beneath me. I backed away, stepping carefully until I felt the wall press against my back. The whispers returned, louder this time, accompanied by the sound of dragging footsteps. Leave. Leave. Leave, they seemed to chant, their distorted voices weaving into the air. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. Suddenly, the lights went out entirely, plunging the room into total darkness. My friends' voices echoed faintly, calling out for me from deeper in the building, but I couldn't find them. I fumbled with my phone, but it was dead. The only sound now was the relentless whispering, growing louder, more urgent. I held my breath, waiting for something to emerge from the shadows, but nothing ever did. Somehow, I found my way out, back through the winding halls, past the echoes of those whispers. My friends never believed me when I told them. To this day, they think I imagined it, that it was just some old factory with nothing more than dust and creaking metal. But I know what I heard, and sometimes, even now, I can still hear the whispers, just faint enough to make my skin crawl. I've always been a creature of habit. Every Friday night, I'd grab my camera and head to the old train tracks that cut through the woods. It wasn't a destination anyone talked about. It was just a place, quiet and desolate, where I could sit and lose myself in the sounds of the passing trains. That night was no different. I parked my car at the edge of the tracks and made my way through the dense underbrush. The woods stretched on forever, the trees towering above, blocking out any sign of the outside world. I loved the solitude, the way everything seemed to pause out here. No phone signal, no noise, no interruptions. Just me and the sound of the tracks stretching into the distance. I set my tripod up, adjusting the camera to capture the faint glow of the distant train lights. As I waited, I realized how dark it had become. The forest had swallowed all light, leaving only the cold glow of the moon casting shadows over the tracks. A slight breeze rustled the leaves, and the distant hum of a train echoed faintly in the distance. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement at the edge of the trees, a shape, slender and dark, blending into the shadows. I thought maybe it was an animal, but there was something unnatural about the way it moved. Smooth, almost fluid, yet completely wrong. I stared, my breath catching in my throat. Whatever it wasn't natural. The figure stepped closer, moving with that same eerie grace, never making a sound. I froze, my finger hovering over the camera. My heart pounded, every nerve on edge. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew better. As it drew nearer, I could make out more details. It wasn't fully human. The proportions were off. Too tall, too thin. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, bending in ways that no person could. But the most disturbing thing was its face. No eyes, no nose, just a blank, hollow void where a face should have been. I wanted to look away, to grab my camera and run, but something held me there, frozen in place. The figure stood just a few feet from me now, its inky, featureless face staring straight ahead. I could feel its gaze on me, even though it had no eyes. That's when I realized it wasn't looking at me. It was looking through me. Panic surged through me, but my legs refused to move. It tilted its head as if examining me. Then, without warning, it turned and vanished into the trees. The silence returned, broken only by the distant rumble of a train far off in the distance. I stumbled backward, my hands trembling as I reached for my camera. The lens trembled as I brought it up, but there was nothing to capture. No figure, no tracks, just the woods. I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to process what I had seen. The train came, its light sweeping through the trees, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I waited, and when it passed, I grabbed my tripod and camera, my mind spinning, unable to shake the feeling that something had been watching me. That something was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I never went back. It was supposed to be a relaxing trip. My friends and I decided to rent a small, secluded cabin by a quiet lake in the mountains. No phones, no internet, just nature and us, looking to escape the city for a few days. I wasn't expecting much, just peace and quiet, maybe a few beers by the fire. The cabin was far off the beaten path, accessible only by a narrow dirt road winding through the forest. We arrived at sunset, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. The cabin itself was old but charming, built from rough timber and surrounded by tall trees. It felt like the perfect escape. That first night, everything was peaceful. We unpacked, built a fire, and enjoyed the stillness of the night. The only sounds were the crackling flames and the occasional rustle of the trees in the breeze. After a few hours, we turned in, exhausted from the long drive. I awoke sometime later. The cabin was quiet, but there was a faint noise that drew me from my sleep. A soft, thudding sound like someone knocking just outside the window. I sat up, my heart pounding. The window was shuttered, but the sound grew louder as if someone was knocking again and again, faster now. I didn't want to believe it, but the thudding was rhythmic, persistent, and coming from right outside. The others were fast asleep, unaware, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread creeping up my spine. I stayed perfectly still, listening, as the sound became louder, more frantic, then silence. My breath caught in my throat as I waited, straining to hear any movement outside. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the night. In the morning, I told my friends about the noise, but they brushed it off. Probably just an animal, they said. I wanted to believe that, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. That afternoon, we decided to go for a hike along one of the trails nearby. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, but there was nothing behind us, just the endless trees and the winding trail. Still, the sense of unease persisted. When we returned to the cabin, something felt different. The air was thicker, the silence more oppressive. That night, as we gathered around the fire, I noticed something strange. The fire flickered unnaturally, casting distorted shadows on the walls. I kept thinking about the knocking I heard, wondering if whatever made that sound had followed us. We decided to turn in early, and once again, I awoke in the middle of the night, this time to the sound of faint whispering. It was soft, almost drowned out by the rustling trees outside, but it was there. I sat up, listening intently, trying to make out what was being said, but the words were indistinct, like they were carried away by the wind. I couldn't move. The whispering grew louder, clearer, until I could almost make out what they were saying. And then it stopped. Just like before, the silence returned. The next morning, I woke to find a dark smear on the window, the same window that had the shutter knocked on the night before. I wasn't sure what it was. It looked like something had pressed itself against the glass, leaving a mark that wouldn't wipe away. That day, my friends decided to leave. I wanted to stay, but the fear of what had been outside was too much to ignore. As we packed the car, I couldn't help but glance back at the cabin one last time. The woods were silent as they had always been, but I knew I wasn't alone. The knocking was still out there, waiting. It was an ordinary Saturday when we decided to explore the old lake. It wasn't just any lake, it was surrounded by dense woods, hidden far from the main road. My friends and I had stumbled upon it years ago while hiking, but never spent much time there. Today, curiosity got the better of us. We packed a picnic and drove out, eager to spend the afternoon away from the usual noise of the city. The day was perfect at first. The sun was warm, the air was fresh, and the lake itself was calm and inviting. We set up our blankets near the shore, and for a few hours it felt like the world had stopped. We swam, took photos, and laughed under the canopy of trees. The forest around us seemed alive, buzzing with insects and birds. But there was something else, something that felt off. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lake, we began to hear faint whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, clearer this time, like voices carried from the depths of the woods. I turned to my friends, but none of them seemed to hear it. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They shook their heads, focused on the lake. I stood up, looking toward the trees. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, and now I was certain I wasn't imagining it. They weren't words, just faint, distorted murmurs, like something from a dream, calling out from the forest. "We should go back," I said, my heart starting to race. The feeling of unease was creeping in, swallowing any sense of peace we had earlier. "No way," one of my friends laughed. "We've got another hour of daylight, we're fine." I hesitated, wanting to stay but feeling that nagging, primal instinct to get out. Still, we stayed a little longer, hoping the sounds would fade. But they didn't. It was like the forest was alive, its very trees whispering to each other. The murmurs were all around us now, growing louder, almost like they were speaking directly to us. One of my friends, Mark, turned white as he stared at the woods, his eyes wide and searching. "I swear I hear something," he said, his voice trembling. "It's not normal." I glanced at the others. None of them seemed to be reacting as strongly, but I could see the tension in their faces. The air had turned colder and the woods were shifting. Silent one moment, then alive with rustling leaves and distant sounds. The sun had disappeared behind the horizon, casting the area in shadows. Everything seemed to grow darker, more foreboding. Mark stood up, his voice barely audible. "We need to go. Now." The others agreed, though reluctantly. We quickly packed our things, keeping our eyes on the trees, half expecting something to emerge from them. The whispers grew louder as we walked toward the car, but no one spoke, too caught up in the creeping dread. When we reached the car, I turned back one last time, searching the forest for any sign of life. That's when I saw it, just a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It wasn't human, though. It was long and twisted, like a shadow, but with shape. It vanished in an instant, but I knew it had been watching us. My friends didn't see it, and I didn't say a word. I just got in the car, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. We drove away from the lake in silence, leaving the strange murmurs behind us. As we drove back toward the main road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us from the darkness. I've never been back to that lake, and I never planned to. Whatever was out there, it felt alive, watching, waiting. And I know now, some things are better left unexplored. My friends and I decided on a whim to take the long trail that stretched along the edge of the cliffs, far from any roads, towns, or lights. We wanted nothing but peace, a chance to get away from everything. We parked at the base of the trail, unloaded our backpacks, and began the slow ascent. The air was clear, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. It was peaceful. That was the only word for it. Peaceful. At first, we hiked for what felt like hours, the trail winding through thick patches of trees that would occasionally break into clearings with breathtaking views of the valley below. It was beautiful, like stepping into another world. At some point, we decided to stop for a break near the edge of the cliffs. The drop below wasn't something to mess with, but we sat there, taking in the view, enjoying the stillness. That's when things started to feel off. We noticed a faint noise, like someone dragging something heavy. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. At first, we figured it was just the wind shifting rocks or something. No big deal. But then, the sound grew closer. I got up, walking a few steps toward the edge of the trail and strained my ears, trying to pinpoint it. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I blinked, and there it was again. A figure. At the edge of the cliff, maybe 50 feet below us, just standing there. No flashlight, no movement, just still, like a shadow cast by the rocks. I could barely make out the details, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural. I called my friends over, but when they looked, there was nothing there. I didn't know what to say. My heart was racing as I tried to convince myself it was just some hiker far off in the distance. We decided to keep walking, thinking maybe we'd imagined it. The trail grew quieter the further we went, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer with each step. We came to a part of the trail where the ground dropped off steeply again, the cliff face towering above us. As we moved closer to that edge, the air seemed heavier. The noise returned, faint, dragging footsteps, but now accompanied by whispers, distant and soft. I could barely make out the words, but they sent chills down my spine. "We're still here," they said. My friends were laughing, unaware of what I'd heard. I looked around, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, but the unease in my chest was growing. The figure was still out there, watching us. I could feel its presence, even though I couldn't see it. We reached a part of the trail where the trees thinned, giving us a view of the valley again. Below, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another figure standing by the edge of the cliff far below, and then another, and another, until the entire expanse below was filled with dark shapes that seemed to be watching us, unmoving. I froze. My friends kept walking, oblivious, but I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my voice wouldn't come. The figures, there were dozens of them, seemed to blend into the shadows of the cliffs, but I could feel their eyes on me. I couldn't look away from the sight below, even as panic began to rise in my chest. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew they were waiting. I turned around and yelled at my friends to stop, but they couldn't hear me. I could barely hear myself. "Guys, stop!" I shouted, my voice barely more than a whisper. They were already too far ahead, unaware of what I had seen. I begged them to come back, but it was like they didn't even hear me. My mind was screaming, "Run back! Run back!" But my feet wouldn't move. My gaze was still locked on the figures far below. The dragging sound grew louder again, this time coming from above, behind me. I could feel something close, closer than it had been before. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw it. The figure from earlier, the one by the cliff, now standing just a few feet away from me. Its face wasn't visible, but I could feel it watching me. Its presence seemed to drown out everything else. The sound of my friends, the wind, everything except the slow, deliberate footsteps drawing closer. "We're still here," it whispered again, and I could feel its breath against my neck. I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure leaned in closer, and I swear I could feel its cold, lifeless stare boring into me. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The dragging noise and whispers faded. The figure stood there for a moment longer, then turned and slowly walked back into the shadows of the cliff. By some miracle, my friends finally heard me screaming, and they ran back to find me. We left that trail as fast as we could, but I can still feel it, like something is out there, waiting, still. I never liked going to the old library. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy reading, but something about that place always unsettled me. It was located deep in town, far from the bustling streets, surrounded by tall, looming trees that seemed to trap the library in perpetual dusk. That day, I had gone in looking for a quiet place to work on a research project. The main hall stretched out in front of me, filled with towering bookshelves packed with forgotten volumes. The air smelled of old paper and dust, like something had been left untouched for too long. I always felt like the library was too quiet, too still, as though the very walls were watching. I found a desk tucked into a corner near the back. The sun barely made it through the high, cracked windows, casting long, dim shadows across the worn wooden floor. I set up my laptop, opened my books, and tried to focus, but the oppressive quiet gnawed at the edges of my concentration. Hours passed, or at least it felt like it. I had no real sense of time in that place. Every creak, every faint whisper of wind from outside seemed magnified in the silence. I was halfway through a particularly dry section of text when I noticed something unusual. A faint noise, barely audible at first, like someone breathing just behind me. I froze, scanning the empty library, but there was no one there. The sound grew louder, sharper, like someone was just inches from my ear. I turned slowly, my pulse quickening. No one. The breathy noise became a low whisper, as though someone was right there speaking into my mind. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it felt off, like the voice wasn't human. I pushed my chair back, my hand trembling as I tried to steady myself. I wanted to run, but something about the stillness of the library held me in place. Then came a distinct echoing creak from the far corner of the room. I didn't want to look, but my head turned on its own. In the dim light, I saw something moving. Shadowy and indistinct, it wavered near the tallest shelf. A figure, barely formed, drifting in and out of sight. My breath caught in my throat. The whispering grew louder, distorted, like it was all around me now. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. It felt like the library itself had swallowed my voice. As I watched, the figure began to shift, growing more distinct. Its features were blurred, but I could see now. Hollow eyes, a twisted, gaping mouth. It didn't move like a person. It drifted, flowing across the room, closer to me. The whispering became a scream, but in my head, not from any source I could find. I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair. The figure didn't stop. It didn't seem to notice me. It was as if it had no awareness of anything but its own existence. It drifted toward the front of the library, toward the rows of ancient books, each step sending a shudder through the floor. Tears streamed down my face as I stumbled out the door, never looking back. The library remained silent, as if it had never noticed I was gone. I don't know what that thing was, and I don't want to find out. But I know I'll never step foot in that library again. I've always loved the forest. There's something about being surrounded by towering trees, the fresh air, and the quiet that draws me in. So, when my friends suggested a weekend camping trip deep into the woods, I didn't hesitate. It sounded perfect, peaceful, serene, just what we needed to escape from the chaos of city life. We packed up our gear, grabbed some supplies, and hiked several miles into the heart of the forest. The trail was narrow, winding, and covered in fallen leaves, but the scenery was breathtaking. As we set up camp, I remember how quiet everything felt. No distant sounds of cars, no faint hum of electricity, just us and the wilderness. The first night was uneventful. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and sat around, laughing and enjoying each other's company. I had never felt more at peace. But when we decided to turn in, something shifted. That night, I kept waking up, hearing strange noises just beyond the trees. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the occasional hoot of an owl. These were softer, quieter sounds, almost like whispers. I brushed them off at first, telling myself it was just the wind, but something about the tone of those whispers felt wrong. Intimate, almost as though they were meant for someone, not just the forest. The second night, things felt different. I couldn't sleep at all. The forest had gone silent. Not the kind of silence you're used to when you're out in nature, but an unnatural, almost oppressive quiet. There wasn't a single sound from any creature. No crickets, no wind, not even the rustle of leaves. It was as if the forest had been drained of all life. At one point, I decided to step out of the tent and check the surroundings. The air was thick, almost suffocating. I shone my flashlight into the woods, expecting to see some critters or movement, but there was nothing. Just darkness. I called out to my friends, but my voice felt swallowed by the stillness. Then I saw it. Something standing far off, just at the edge of the trees. It wasn't a person, at least not a normal one. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and it didn't move like a human. Its silhouette was dark, almost blending into the night, but the more I stared, the more I felt like its presence was wrong. The air seemed to pulse around it, and I swear I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. I froze, my breath hitching. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. It didn't seem curious. It didn't feel human. It felt watchful in a way that made my skin crawl. I backed away, slowly retreating into the tent, my heart racing. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound, every rustle of leaves made me flinch, but nothing else came. The next morning, my friends were awake, laughing, acting like nothing had happened. They didn't hear the whispers, didn't see the figure in the woods. When I told them, they just shrugged it off, calling me paranoid. I didn't press the issue. We packed up our gear, leaving the quiet forest behind us, still unsure of what we'd encountered. It wasn't until we were back in town that I realized something truly terrifying. I checked my phone. No service, as expected. But when I scrolled through my pictures from the trip, I froze at what I found. In the photos from the night before, something appeared. A faint, shadowy figure standing among the trees, barely visible but unmistakably there. It wasn't just a trick of the light or my imagination. It was real. And somehow, whatever it was, it had been watching us. I don't know what it wanted, and I never want to go back to that place. Some things are better left unseen. I wasn't the kind of person who believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I've always been a logical thinker, someone who dismissed old tales and rumors as nothing more than silly distractions. That changed one night on a solitary trip to the old family lake house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small cabin tucked deep in the woods by a quiet, remote lake. My family used to go there when I was a kid, but we hadn't been back in years. After hearing it was in rough shape, I decided to check it out one weekend, just to make sure everything was still standing. The drive took longer than I remembered, the road winding through dense forest that swallowed any light from the moon. The lake house itself was hidden from view until you were nearly upon it. It stood there, dark and silent, its windows covered in grime and cobwebs. I grabbed my flashlight and headed inside. The interior was in worse condition than I expected. Dust and mold covered everything. Cobwebs hung like torn curtains, and the wooden floorboards creaked under every step. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air, though I wasn't sure if that was going to help with the oppressive silence. That evening, after checking for any signs of wildlife, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The lake itself was calm, reflecting the trees in a perfect mirror, but the air had a strange stillness to it, as if something had been watching and waiting for me to arrive. As night fell, I made a fire outside, sitting by the lake to enjoy the peace. The crackling flames didn't do much to comfort me, though. The woods around me seemed to hold their breath, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing as the minutes passed. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a faint whispering, barely audible but persistent, carried on the wind. I froze, listening, my skin crawling. The whispers didn't come from any particular direction but seemed to be all around me. I stood, heart racing, and scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. The silence returned. But the unease wouldn't go away. I convinced myself it was just the wind, some sound that had traveled from miles away and got distorted in the stillness. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, the sound of my own breath echoing in the empty cabin. I slept fitfully that night, plagued by strange dreams. I kept waking up, feeling like something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows. Each time I opened my eyes, the room seemed darker than before. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the lake. The sun was bright, the forest alive with birdsong, but something still felt off. As I walked, I found old, faded footprints in the dirt. My heart skipped a beat when I realized they weren't mine. They looked much older, but perfectly preserved in the soft ground. I kept walking, pushing away the growing sense of dread. That's when I saw them. Footprints leading from the cabin, circling around the lake. But not just a few. The footprints stretched as far as I could see, as if something had been walking these woods for years. I turned back towards the cabin, but before I could make it, I saw something by the water's edge. A figure stood there, just beyond the trees, its form indistinct, its face obscured by shadows. I froze, unable to move as I stared at it. It wasn't human. Not really. The figure's shape was wrong, its posture unnatural, like something trying to mimic a person but failing. Panic set in as I realized it was watching me, tilting its head as if studying me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The whispering started again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from inside my head. Leave, leave, leave. The whisper repeated itself, growing louder, closer, until I couldn't tell if it was real or in my head. I turned to run, but the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. I made it back to the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it again. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I spent the rest of the day packing up and preparing to leave. The whispers never stopped. They echoed in my head long after I was back in my car, long after I was miles away from that place. To this day, I haven't been able to forget that trip. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I can still hear those whispers. Not out loud, but in my mind, like they're waiting, always watching. It started on a normal afternoon, a day like any other. I had taken my son to the old park, the one we used to go to when he was younger. The park had always been a peaceful escape from the city, full of tall trees and winding paths that led nowhere in particular. Today, though, something felt off. We had the whole place to ourselves, which wasn't unusual. It was a weekday, and most people didn't visit parks during these hours. I let my son run ahead, chasing after a frisbee he'd thrown. I stood at the edge of a small pond watching him play. The water rippled under the weight of the afternoon sun, and the sound of the birds was soothing. Then, out of nowhere, everything changed. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned, expecting to see another parent or maybe a jogger, but there was no one. Just trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. Must be my imagination, I muttered to myself. But as I turned back to the pond, the footsteps came again. This time, closer. My son didn't seem to notice, still lost in his game. I told myself I was just on edge. The woods could make noises feel louder than they were, right? But the footsteps weren't fading. They were steady, relentless. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I tried to convince myself that maybe someone had wandered into the park, someone harmless. Still, my heart pounded in my chest and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around, trying to find the source of the sound, but saw no one. The footsteps came again, closer this time, circling around the pond. My son, still unaware, continued chasing the frisbee, laughing as he ran. "Stop playing," I shouted, my voice trembling now. "We're leaving." He didn't hear me. Or maybe he didn't care. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my composure, but my legs felt like they wanted to run. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, but I couldn't just leave him. Then, as I stepped toward the pond, I saw something. Something in the water. It wasn't a reflection. It was a figure. A shadow, floating just beneath the surface. It wasn't moving like anything natural. It seemed to be watching us. Unmoving. Unmoving. I took a step back from the water, my breath hitching in my throat. What was it? Some kind of trick of the light? My mind raced, but fear took over. I had to get my son. "Come on," I called again, louder this time, my voice breaking. My son didn't seem to hear me. He was too far gone in his play, oblivious to the danger I now felt closing in. I sprinted toward him, my heart screaming with every step. I grabbed his arm, pulling him hard. His laughter stopped, replaced by confusion. "What's wrong, Dad?" "We're leaving." "Now," I said, trying to keep my voice calm but firm. As I turned back toward the path, I saw it again. The figure, this time fully visible. It stood at the edge of the pond, watching us. Not human, not animal. Something else entirely. Its form was blurred, not entirely solid, but its eyes were unmistakable. Dark, hollow, watching us. I held my son tighter, running, my breath ragged. We didn't look back, didn't stop until we were far away from that place. As we reached the park entrance, I glanced once more over my shoulder. The figure was still there, motionless, watching us. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat, racing through my ears. We never went back to that park, and I never looked into water the same way again. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon when I decided to go for a drive. I had been feeling restless lately, and the open road seemed like the perfect escape. I grabbed my keys, jumped into my car, and drove aimlessly, taking whatever turns felt right. Eventually, I found myself deep in the countryside, miles from any sign of civilization. The roads twisted and turned, surrounded by nothing but trees and fields. The further I drove, the quieter it became. No cars, no people, just the hum of the engine and the distant chirp of birds. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. After a while, I came across an old farmhouse. Its paint was peeling and the windows were dark and empty. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Curiosity got the better of me, so I pulled up beside the house, parking a little ways off the dusty driveway. I sat there for a moment, staring at the abandoned building. There was something unsettling about it, something that didn't sit right. I decided to get out and take a closer look. The wooden porch creaked under my feet as I approached the front door. Dust and cobwebs covered every surface. The house smelled old, like something had been left to rot inside. My breath fogged up the cracked window and I peered inside. It was empty, completely stripped of life. Chairs lay overturned, curtains torn and hanging in tatters. It was as if the house had been waiting for someone to return. As I wandered through the house, a strange feeling settled over me. The air was still, almost too still. It felt as if I wasn't alone. My skin crawled, and I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I called out, but no answer came. It was like the world had gone silent, the kind of silence that feels oppressive, as if something is breathing just beyond it. Upstairs, I found a room at the end of a narrow hallway. The door was slightly ajar, creaking when I pushed it open. Inside, the room was filled with faded furniture and more cobwebs. On the wall was a single photograph, worn and faded, its edges curling up. A family stood there, smiling, though their eyes seemed hollow, their grins fake. The photo sent a chill down my spine. Then I heard a sound from below, a faint, distant thud. My heart skipped a beat. I listened, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was walking through the house. I stood frozen, listening. The footsteps came from downstairs, echoing up the creaking staircase. I should have run, I knew that, but my legs wouldn't move. The fear had paralyzed me. Then I heard it, the sound of something else, a faint whispering voice. I couldn't make out the words, just the soft murmur as if someone was speaking in another language. It came from below, growing louder, as if whatever it was had found its way into the house. Tears filled my eyes as I forced myself to move. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to go back to the front door. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I moved slowly down the stairs, each creak beneath my feet sounding louder than the last. At the front door, I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. I had never been more afraid in my life. The whispers had grown so loud, they felt like they were in my head. I turned the knob, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the daylight. The house looked different from the outside, somehow darker, more twisted. I expected to see someone standing there watching me, but there was nothing, just the empty fields stretching out before me. The whispering faded, and the silence returned. I drove away without looking back. The house stayed with me, though. The image of that photograph, the whispering voice, it all felt too real. I don't know what I experienced that day, and I don't want to know. Some things are better left unexplained. I was always someone who believed in the familiar. the predictable. My life had always been about routine, and I liked it that way. That's why, when my friend convinced me to take a road trip to an old remote lighthouse for the weekend, I wasn't thrilled, but I went along anyway. It wasn't the kind of place I'd ever consider visiting, but something about the isolation appealed to my friend, and I didn't want to miss out. The lighthouse was situated on a rugged coastline, far from civilization. The drive there took hours, and as we approached, the only sounds were the wind and the crashing waves below. There were no other cars on the road, no other people. It felt as if we had stepped into a world that no one else remembered. When we finally reached the lighthouse, we parked and began our hike up the steep, crumbling path that led to the base. The wind was strong, biting through our jackets as we made our way to the top. The view from the lighthouse was breathtaking. Vast, empty stretches of ocean and rocky cliffs stretching into the horizon. We spent the day exploring the area, taking photos, and marveling at how quiet everything was. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the land, we decided to climb inside the lighthouse. The door creaked open, and the smell of old, damp wood hit us. Inside, the old spiral staircase wound up into darkness. We climbed carefully, each step echoing louder than before. The higher we went, the colder it became. I had a strange sensation that something, was watching us from the shadows below. When we reached the top, the wind howled louder than ever. The view was incredible, but the feeling of being completely alone started to gnaw at my thoughts. The sky was painted in deep purples and oranges, and the ocean stretched endlessly before us. It was peaceful, yet something felt off. As we explored the small room at the top of the lighthouse, we found old, faded charts and logs, abandoned years ago. The emptiness was almost overwhelming. I kept glancing behind me, as if expecting to see someone, or something, watching from the corners of the room. We stayed until the sun had fully set, but as the darkness deepened, my unease grew. The wind had died down now, leaving a heavy silence. It felt as though the world had stopped turning. My friend began to pack up, but I stayed by the window staring at the horizon, waiting for something that I couldn't put into words. It wasn't until I was about to leave the room that I noticed something strange. On one of the old, dusty tables by the window, there was a single, neatly folded piece of paper. I almost missed it, but something about the way it seemed out of place drew my attention. Curious, I unfolded it. It wasn't a log or any kind of note I could make sense of. The writing was old and faded, but as I read it, a chill ran down my spine. They watch. They listen. Always. We begged for help, but there was no one left to hear. They took them all. My breath caught in my throat. I looked around the empty room, my eyes scanning the shadows. The silence felt heavier than ever, and my pulse began to race. I wasn't alone. I tucked the paper into my jacket, and we left the lighthouse as quickly as we could, the weight of what I had read pressing down on me. The drive back was quiet, but every shadow seemed to whisper in my mind, and the thought of that unknown presence stayed with me long after we left. To this day, I still wonder who wrote that note, and what it meant. It was late summer, and I'd gone on a solo camping trip, something I hadn't done in years. My usual companions had fallen through, but I felt an odd pull to get away from everything and find some peace in the quiet of the wilderness. I chose a remote spot deep in the forest, far from any trails or campsites. I wanted isolation, and I got it. The first day was perfect. The forest stretched out in every direction, vast and untouched. I set up my tent near a small stream, and the sound of running water helped calm my restless mind. There were no signs of other people, no other sounds except for the occasional rustling of leaves and birdsong. That night, as I sat by the fire, I thought about how peaceful it all felt. I'd grown so used to the noise of city life, and now, surrounded by nothing but nature, it was like the world had slowed down. I didn't feel the usual anxiety or stress that had followed me in recent months, but as I lay in my tent, drifting off to sleep, I was suddenly jolted awake. Something had rustled outside. I sat up, listening intently. The forest was still, save for the sound of my own heartbeat. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was near. The night passed in silence after that. I convinced myself it was just my nerves. The forest can play tricks on you, and my overactive imagination was likely running wild. By morning, I was ready to forget the incident. But as I broke camp, I noticed something strange. Around my tent, the ground was uneven, disturbed. It looked like something heavy had walked through during the night, leaving deep, uneven prints. I followed the trail they made, huge, unnatural footprints that seemed to lead away from the stream and deeper into the woods. I told myself it was probably an animal. Bears roamed these parts, sure, but the tracks were larger than anything I'd ever seen before. They were too large, the stride too long. I tried to brush it off as fatigue playing tricks on me. That afternoon, as I ventured further into the forest, something shifted. The usual sounds of the woods, birds chirping, leaves rustling, became distant, faint. The silence returned, but this time, it was more oppressive. It felt as though the forest was holding its breath. I stopped walking and listened. There was nothing. No breeze, no distant rustling. Just silence. A sudden chill ran down my spine as I realized how alone I was. At first, I thought of turning back, but something kept pulling me forward. Curiosity, maybe, or the strange feeling that I wasn't truly alone. Against my better judgment, I pressed on, deeper into the woods, following the trail of those strange footprints. I don't know how long I walked, lost in thought and the eerie stillness of the forest. Suddenly, I stumbled upon a clearing, one that had no right to be there. It wasn't a natural formation, but rather it felt carved out. The trees surrounding it stood unnaturally still, their branches twisting toward the ground as if weighed down by unseen forces. In the center of the clearing stood something I can't fully explain. It was humanoid, though not human. Its form was obscured, shadowy, and indistinct, like it was made of fog. I could barely make out its shape, but its presence felt palpable, almost suffocating. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared at it, unsure if I was still dreaming or if this was something real. The creature, if that's what it was, turned its head slowly in my direction. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze on me. Cold, empty, and infinite. Something in its presence made my skin crawl. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. It felt like I was frozen, trapped in its gaze. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. The clearing was empty once more, as though it had never been there at all. I turned and stumbled back, not sure how far I had come. My mind was racing, the sound of my own footsteps echoing through the silent forest. Every step felt heavier, like I was being followed, though I didn't dare look back. By the time I reached my tent, I didn't stop. I packed everything in a daze and left, not looking back at the deep woods that had become so foreign. I don't know what I saw that day. I've tried to convince myself it was just some trick of the mind, that the isolation and silence had gotten to me. But the footprints, they were real. The figure in the clearing, whatever it was real. I've never gone back to the woods since. It was the kind of evening where the sky seemed to press down on everything, as if it wanted to swallow the world whole. My friends and I had decided to take a drive out to the old abandoned lighthouse, miles from any town, where the cliffs stretched out over the ocean like they were reaching toward the sky itself. The lighthouse had been shut down decades ago, long before anyone could remember. We'd heard rumors that it was haunted, but we didn't believe in that kind of stuff. We just wanted an adventure. The road to get there was narrow, winding, and barely lit by a few flickering streetlights that flickered on and off like they were uncertain of their own purpose. We parked the car at the base of the cliffs and began walking toward the lighthouse. The air smelled of salt and decay, The kind of place where you feel like you've stepped out of time. The lighthouse stood there, looming and skeletal against the darkening sky. Its red brick tower stood like a sentinel, long forgotten, its windows cracked and covered in moss. We reached the entrance, a heavy metal door that creaked open with a groan. Inside, everything was covered in dust. The old lanterns hung from the walls, cobwebs stretched between them. The faint smell of mildew and dampness clung to everything. We walked up the narrow staircase, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the confined space. The higher we climbed, the darker it got. The dim light from the lanterns barely illuminated our path. I kept expecting to hear something. Footsteps, whispers, or maybe the creak of an old floorboard. Something to break the silence. But all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick, and the soft shuffle of my friends behind me. Finally, we reached the top. The door at the top of the staircase creaked open, and we stepped out onto the balcony of the lighthouse. The wind hit us, sharp and cold, as we looked out over the cliffs. The ocean stretched out endlessly beneath us. The waves crashed far below, their roar distant and faint. The horizon stretched into nothingness, the darkness blending with the sea. We stood there, taking in the view, laughing and joking. We were miles from civilization, miles from anything that could disturb us. Or so we thought. That's when I heard it. The soft scraping sound, like something dragging itself across the floor below us. I turned to my friends, but they didn't seem to hear it. I figured it was the wind, some old creaking of the lighthouse settling into the darkness. But then it came again, louder, more deliberate. This time, it wasn't below us. It was above. I froze, staring up toward the narrow spiral staircase that led to the top of the tower. The scraping noise was now followed by the faint sound of ragged breathing, labored and slow, like something struggling to draw in air. My hands trembled as I pointed upward. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, but my voice was lost in the wind. My friends looked at me, puzzled. I swallowed hard, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind was playing tricks on my mind. But then came the unmistakable sound of a voice, low and cracked, whispering something I couldn't make out. We were alone up there. I knew it. The others insisted it was probably the wind or some animal, but my instincts told me otherwise. I grabbed my friend's arm and whispered, "We need to get out of here." We turned, bolting down the staircase as fast as we could, the sound of our footsteps pounding in our ears. The scraping noise followed us, but it was closer now, louder. It sounded like it was climbing after us. When we reached the base of the tower, the door was still open. But what we saw outside wasn't normal. There was something standing by the car, something too tall, too thin, with its back bent unnaturally. It didn't move like a person. It was more like a shadow, stretching toward us in the dim light. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow, dark, and seemed to burn with a cold, inhuman light. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. The others were frozen in place, too terrified to move. The figure turned its head slowly as if observing us, and then started to walk toward us. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it wasn't sure what it wanted. Without thinking, we bolted down the cliffside, the figure still behind us. The wind howled louder, but we didn't stop. We didn't stop until we reached the car and drove away, not looking back. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. I haven't been able to go near that lighthouse since. Whatever was up there, waiting for us, still lingers in my mind. Some places, I've learned, are better left untouched. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip with a group of friends. We decided to take a hike through a dense, unfamiliar forest. No cabins, no gas stations, just trees and nature for miles. I wasn't the outdoorsy type, but something about getting away from the city's chaos sounded appealing. We parked at a trailhead that felt like it hadn't seen visitors in years. The road was overgrown, and the air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Our group of 5 took our first steps into the forest, the sunlight filtering through the canopy above. It was peaceful, serene, or so I thought. About an hour into the hike, things began to feel off. The path we'd been following seemed to narrow, the trees closing in around us. We'd all become quiet, unsure if we were heading the right way. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, distant birds, had fallen silent. It was like we were walking through some uncharted, forgotten place. "Are we even on the trail anymore?" one of my friends asked, her voice uncertain. I stopped and looked around. The trees were so thick, and the sunlight barely broke through. It felt unnatural. But before I could suggest turning back, we noticed something strange. A figure, just a glimpse, moving deeper into the woods. "Did anyone else see that?" someone whispered, their voice barely audible. We all exchanged uneasy glances. The figure had been too tall, too dark. None of us could make out its features, but we could feel its presence. It didn't belong in these woods. "We should follow it," someone said, their voice shaking. Reluctantly, we pressed on. The deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. The forest seemed to shift, twisting into something darker. The trees grew taller, the air growing colder. Every step felt heavier, as if the very ground beneath us was resisting our presence. Hours passed, or so it felt. The light grew dim, the woods silent except for the crunch of our footsteps. The figure was always just out of sight, moving further away. We wanted to call out, to demand answers, but our voices felt frozen in our throats. Suddenly, one of my friends stopped walking, their face pale. Where did everyone go?" they whispered. I spun around. The others had vanished. No trace, no sound. Just me and the forest. My heart began to pound in my chest as I realized I was alone, surrounded by trees that felt alive. I called out, but there was no response. My friends had disappeared, and the silence returned. I wandered aimlessly, trying to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to shift with every attempt. It felt like the trees were closing in on me, squeezing me tighter. Then I heard it, a faint whispering. Voices, but not human. They sounded hollow, like they were echoing from the very woods themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was haunting, sorrowful. I tried to run, but my legs gave out, the ground beneath me uneven and slippery. As I struggled to my feet, I saw the figure again. This time it was closer, taller, more menacing. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dim light, watching me with a dead, hollow stare. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, waiting. I felt something brush against my arm, a cold, bony touch that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to fight back, but whatever was out there was far beyond anything I could comprehend. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. For what felt like hours, I wandered through the woods, not knowing if I was even going in the right direction. I couldn't hear any of my friends, but I knew they couldn't have gone far. The whispering voices persisted, growing louder, more desperate. Finally, I broke through the trees and saw the trailhead, familiar now. The sun was rising, casting long shadows on the ground. My friends were gone, but the figure was nowhere to be seen. I made my way back to the car, breathless and shaken. The forest remained quiet, the eerie calm settling over me like a shroud. My friends were never found. To this day, I've never been able to explain what happened. The woods had taken them, and they took part of me with them, too.